Chapter 41. Chapter 41. The Mountain. A wise practice. Marjorie turned fully toward him now, her green silks brushing against his leather armor. Tell me, Alaric, do you find our southern knights as impressive as the stories say? Or are they just boys in shiny tin? Shiny tin can still kill a man if the spear is sharp, Alaric replied, his eyes never leaving the lists. But a man who spends more time polishing his plate than training in the mud is usually the first to fall when the horse trips. Marjorie's eyebrows arched. Pragmatic. My brother Loras would likely disagree. He spends hours on his appearance, but he is skilled. Perhaps you'll see him today. I look forward to it, Alaric said. The small talk ended at once. A trumpet sounded. Ser Gregor Clegane rode into the lists. The mountain that rides sat atop a warhorse that looked more beast than animal. His armor was so thick it seemed it should crush the man inside it. Across the field waited Ser Hugh of the Vale. His armor shone bright and new, fresh from the day he earned his knighthood. As the horses thundered toward one another, Alaric's enhanced senses picked up the anomaly. The mountain didn't aim for the shield. He aimed high. With a sickening, splintering crash, the mountain's lance didn't shatter against armor. It drove straight into the boy's throat. A jagged shard of heavy wood pierced the gorget, bursting through the other side in a spray of bright arterial crimson. The silence that followed was. Ser Hugh's body lay twisted in the dirt, his blue surcoat darkening rapidly as his lifeblood soaked into the earth. Beside him, Marjorie Tyrell was chillingly different while Sansa just closed her eyes. She didn't look away. The mountain trotted his monstrous stallion back toward the pavilions, passing directly beneath the royal box. Queen Cersei, draped in emerald silk, didn't recoil in disgust like the other ladies. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Gregor Clegane's visor. A faint, icy ghost of a smile touched her lips. Gregor didn't stop at his pavilion. He wheeled the beast around, hooves churning the bloody mud, and came to a halt directly in front of the section where Alaric sat between the Stark and Tyrell. The scale of the man was suffocating. Up close, he reeked of sour sweat, rusted iron, and old blood. Gregor looked up, his voice muffled by his helm but booming like a drum made of bone. I heard the Ned brought a ward from the frozen wastes, Gregor spat, his gaze raking over Alaric's leather gear with open disdain. A Northman who hides behind girls while real knights spill blood. He let out a harsh, rasping laugh, gesturing with a gore-stained gauntlet toward the dead boy being hauled from the dirt. You Northmen talk of winter and honor, yet you sit there like gelded hounds. If there's a man left in that shivering lot, let him come down here and find out what a real blade feels like. He leaned in closer, his stallion snorting foam onto the railing near Sansa's dress. Or maybe you're all just like the little lady here, pretty to look at but soft enough to break with one hand. The air around Alaric began to ripple. The shadow at his feet, where Nyx lay dormant, grew unnaturally dark, stretching toward the mountain's horse. Alaric didn't move a muscle or reach for a weapon. He simply looked down at Gregor Clegane with the calm, heavy intent of a butcher eyeing a rabid dog. The North doesn't waste its men on dogs barking for scraps. Alaric's voice dropped into a rasp that carried clearly over the stunned crowd. But if you're so eager to find a man, Gregor, be careful. You might find one who doesn't stop at your throat. The mountain's hand tightened on the reins, his horse skittering back as it sensed a predator larger than itself. Marjorie Tyrell leaned in, her jasmine sent a sharp contrast to the mountain's filth, her lips nearly brushing Alaric's ear. Don't let him draw you into the mud, she whispered urgently. He's trying to provoke you. Alaric ignored her. His focus shifted past the giant to the royal pavilion, where Cersei watched with a mocking, triumphant glint. Alaric met her gaze with an expression so cold it seemed to sap the warmth from the sun, then looked back at Gregor. You want to see if the North has men? I am the ward of a great house, Clegane. I don't soil my boots for every stray that growls in the street. But if you're desperate for a lesson. Alaric raised 2 fingers. From the edge of the lists a figure moved. His blood scout, clad in dark, supple leathers with a cowl masking all but a pair of eyes like an hunter, vaulted the barricade. He walked silently beside Alaric. This is my friend, Alaric said, his voice ringing with absolute confidence. If you can even lay a finger on him, I'll step into the dirt and let you take a swing at me. But if you can't hit him, perhaps you should go back to bullying squires. Alaric leaned back, a dark smirk tugging at his lips as he ran the internal calculations. Gregor was a fortress, high strength and endurance, but his agility was abysmal. A fortress couldn't catch the wind. Gregor's face turned a purplish-black behind his visor. The insult was total. To be told he wasn't worthy of the master, only the servant, was a slap to his pride. "I'll butcher your pet," Gregor roared, unsheathing his 6-foot greatsword with a scream of tortured metal. "And then I'll use his skin to wrap the girl." The arena was cleared as the king, sensing a spectacle, leaned forward with a boisterous grin. Gregor roared and swung a massive horizontal arc. The blade cut the air hard enough to take a horse's head, but it found nothing. The blood scout did not dodge so much as vanish. As the steel swept past, he appeared behind Gregor and rapped the back of the mountain's helm with the flat of his black glass dagger. A quiet insult. Gregor answered with blind rage. He hacked again and again. Great downward blows smashed the fencing apart, wood bursting into splinters, but the scout slipped through it all untouched. Chapter 42, Margaery Invitation. The mountain was soon heaving, his massive lungs pumping like bellows while the heat radiating from his plate armor became visible in the air. He was a titan fighting a ghost. Sansa watched with wide, crystalline eyes. Her fear had been replaced by a fierce, soaring pride. She didn't look at the monster, she looked at Allaric. She saw him sitting there, relaxed, dominant, his hand resting possessively near her. Finally, Gregor let out a gargle of rage, overextending on a massive overhead strike that buried his greatsword a foot deep into the earth. It was the opening Alaric had waited for. The blood scout surged forward, dropping low to the ground, and delivered 2 surgical, precision kicks to the back of Gregor's ankles, the vulnerable gaps in the plate where the tendons were exposed. The sound of snapping bone and buckling steel echoed across the silent grounds as the giant collapsed. Crack! The sound of the mountain's collapse was like a siege tower toppling. Gregor's knees didn't just bend, they buckled under the impossible strain, sending him crashing forward into the filth. His armor hit the ground with a deafening, discordant ring that echoed across the silent lists. He lay there, face down in the mud and the blood of the boy he had just murdered, struggling like a flipped beetle beneath the weight of his own impenetrable steel. The silence that followed was absolute. A common servant had brought the most feared man in the 7 kingdoms to his knees without breaking a sweat. Alaric slowly turned his head toward the royal pavilion. Cersei Lannister's face was a mask of ugly, contorted fury. Her perfect composure had shattered, replaced by the raw, jagged realization that her mad dog had been publicly neutered. Alaric caught her gaze and let a slow, deliberate smirk spread across his face, the exact mocking expression she had worn moments before. System notification, objective complete. Reward, plus 1,000 monarch points. Current MP, 5,932. Margaery Tyrell leaned back, her eyes darting between the defeated mountain and Alaric. Alaric rose, his hand sliding from Sansa's as he turned to leave the stands. "I believe the lesson is over," he said. "A well-played hand, Lord Alaric," Margaery replied. Her voice held a new note of respect. "But you've made an enemy of the queen. In this city, humiliation is paid back with poison." Alaric did not blink. "Was she ever not my enemy? And my blood has buried worse than her tricks." Margaery said nothing. The warmth she wore so easily fell away, replaced by a cool, measuring calm. She watched him the way one watches a sleeping dragon, with respect and the uneasy sense that the order of King's Landing had just shifted. What he had done to Gregor Clegane without even rising from his seat made the knights around them. She looked at her brother Loras, who was staring at the mud-stained mountain in shock, and then back to Alaric. "The sun is high and the air here is foul," Alaric said, his voice a low, steady rasp. "Lady Sansa Arya, it is time to return to the tower." Sansa rose with a stiff, regal grace, her hand instinctively finding Alaric's arm for support. She didn't look back at the mountain or the queen. Her gaze was fixed solely on the man beside her. Arya followed, clutching needle with white-knuckled intensity, her eyes darting between Alaric and the literal shadow where Nyx lay hidden. He led them through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea. Commoners whispered his name, and knights turned their heads in a mix of fear and envy. He could feel Cersei's eyes burning into his back, but with nearly 6,000 MP, the queen's fury felt as insignificant as the buzzing of a fly. As they reached the relative safety of the Tower of the Hand, Margaery's final words echoed in the air. She had turned to Sansa at the last moment, her voice a melodic lilt that pushed back the metallic tang of the tourney grounds. Sansa, Marjorie had said, her fingers briefly touching the girl's hand like an olive branch. The air here is too thick with blood. My grandmother, the Lady Olenna, is hosting a small supper tonight in our gardens. It is away from the prying eyes of the court, where we can speak as women, not symbols. I would be honored if you joined us. And of course, she added, her green eyes flicking to Allaric with a spark, you must bring your Mr. Allaric. The Lady Sansa would be honored to accept, my lady, Allaric replied, his voice a low, steady rasp. A garden is a fine place for a conversation, provided one knows which roses have the sharpest thorns. Marjorie let out a delighted silver laugh. Oh, Allaric, I think you'll find our thorns are much more polite than the ones you've encountered today. She stood, her silks rustling as she gave the ward a final, lingering look before disappearing into the crowd toward the Tyrell pavilion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Blackwater in shades of bruised purple and gold, Allaric escorted Sansa and Arya to the Tyrell manse. The air here was different, sweetened by hundreds of imported jasmine plants and cooled by marble fountains. The manse was a world of suffocating sweetness, a far cry from the sharp, honest cold of Winterfell. Lanterns hung from ancient trees like trapped stars, casting flickering amber light over marble paths. Marjorie didn't waste time. She slipped her arm through Sansa's with practiced sisterly affection. Come, Sansa. The moon lilies are in full bloom. They are far more interesting than men talking of war and horses. She glanced back at Arya, who was eyeing the high-priced topiary as if searching for a place to hide a blade. Arya, darling, the Septa mentioned your interest in the archives. My steward can show you the records of the Reach. We have several illustrated volumes on the flowers. Septa Mordain beamed, won over by the hospitality. How thoughtful, my lady. Come, Arya. Arya looked ready to protest, but a sharp glance from Alaric silenced her. She followed the Septa, her hand never drifting far from Needle's hilt. Chapter 43, Lady Olenna Tyrell and Littlefinger. Alaric stood at the edge of the garden, dark against the green. Ivy climbed the stone behind him. Birds stirred in the hedges. He did not look around, yet he knew where the Tyrell guards waited among the trellises. Good men. Careful. Too slow to matter. Sansa and Marjorie drifted ahead, their voices thinning as they passed deeper between the flowers. A dry cough broke the quiet. You can stop watching the borders, Thorne, a voice said. If my guards wished you dead, you'd have fallen while admiring the roses. The sound came from a small stone gazebo wrapped in ivy. Lady Olenna Tyrell sat beneath it in a tall weirwood chair. Gold cloth pooled around her thin frame. She held a grape in one hand and a silver knife in the other, peeling the skin away in a slow spiral. Sit, she said without looking up. I won't shout at giants. It pulls something dreadful in the chest. Alaric sat on the stone bench. The knife kept moving. Peel. Turn. Slice. Her eyes lifted only when the fruit was bare. Such excitement today, she said. It's been years since the court had anything worth gossiping over. Alaric said nothing. Olenna clicked her tongue. The city smells worse every year. Rot has a way of rising when coin runs thin. She studied him over the rim of the grape. And our dear king grows restless. Men often do when they feel trapped. She waited. Alaric gave a small sound that might have been agreement. Might not. Her mouth twitched. The knife resumed its work. They spoke like that for a long while. She circled. He did not move. Words slid past him and found no purchase. At last the grapes were gone. Later, when the moon sat high, footsteps returned along the path. Marjorie emerged first, bright and composed. Sansa followed, calmer than she had been in days, her shoulders no longer drawn tight. The walk back through the keep passed in silence. Sansa stayed close. Once or twice her arm brushed his, light and unplanned. He did not shift away. At her door she paused. Fatigue softened her eyes. Rest well, Alaric said. She smiled, small, honest, and slipped inside. The door closed. Alaric turned at once and melted back into the stone and shadow, heading for his own chambers without a sound. Peter Baelish found Ned Stark alone beneath the covered gallery. A lively day, Baelish said, sliding into the space beside Ned with the noiseless grace. The court hasn't had a scandal this delicious to chew on in years. Ned did not look at him. Men enjoy spectacle. They enjoy the smell of blood more. Peter folded his hands, his rings glinting like serpent scales. And your ward has provided a vintage crop. A boy of flexible parentage rising so high so fast? It's the sort of story that makes men of better birth feel quite small. And quite hungry. He serves House Stark, Ned said, his voice a low rumble. That is all he needs to do. Peter hummed, a thin, discordant sound. Of course. But the capital is a city of merchants, Ned. We look at a young girl, a high-born treasure promised to a prince, and we see an asset. When that asset spends too much time in the company of a charming nobody, well, the market price drops. Ned's head snapped toward him, his eyes like flint. Baelish didn't flinch. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, which remained fixed on the yard below as if calculating the cost of Ned's soul. Forgive me. I forget you Northmen think a girl's virtue is guarded by walls. Here it is guarded by whispers. And right now? The whispers are painting a very vivid picture of your daughter and your ward. Ned's hand moved instinctively toward his belt. You would do well to mind your tongue, Lord Baelish. Oh, it isn't my tongue you should fear. Peter leaned in closer, the faint scent of mint and dried blood, or perhaps it was just the city, clinging to him. I've seen girls discarded for less than a shared look. A stain on a dress, a corridor crossed at the wrong hour, the truth is irrelevant. Once the mud is thrown, the girl is ruined. And a ruined girl is a useless daughter. He tilted his head, watching a muscle jump in Ned's jaw with visible relish. And stains spread, don't they? They crawl up from the ward to the daughter, to the father who is too blind, or perhaps too kind, to see the rot under his own roof. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. In this city, Baelish whispered, his voice dripping with a sickly, false sympathy, a girl's honor is a coin. Once spent, it's gone. And your ward is currently tossing your daughter's coin into the gutter just to see it spin. Ned turned fully, his stature towering over the smaller man. Choose your next words carefully. My daughter and my ward are under my protection. If either name is dragged through the dirt, I will not look for the source of the rumor. I will look for you. Baelish's smile tightened for a flicker of a second, a flash of pure, cold envy for the man who had the power to threaten him, before it smoothed back into a mask of polite concern. Of course, Peter said softly. I only wish to spare you the shock when the king hears the same story. This city feeds on fathers who believe honor is a shield. It isn't. It's a target. He bowed, a mockery of respect, and withdrew. He left the air feeling oily like the residue of a fever. Ned remained long after, his heart hammering against his ribs. He told himself the man was a liar, a creature of spite and silk. But the poison had already entered the vein. As he looked down into the yard, he didn't see his ward or his daughter. He saw the ruin Baelish had described, and the man's lingering, hungry smile. Alaric sat alone in his chambers. The room lay dark except for the pale blue glow hanging in the air before him. 5,932 MP. The number did not thrill him the way it should have. The rush from the day before still lingered in his body, the crowd, the shock, the way the mountain had fallen without ever touching him. Power still hummed under his skin. But King's Landing had a way of sobering a man once the noise faded. He stared at the stone wall. His shadow stretched long across it. Within that darkness, Nyx's amber eyes blinked once, watchful. Margaery Tyrell, he said quietly. The name tasted dangerous. She smiled sweetly, listened closely, and missed nothing. She wanted the throne as badly as Cersei ever had, only with cleaner hands. The Reach stood behind her like a loaded crossbow, and she knew it. Getting close enough to bind her would not be simple. Not here. Not with Lannister eyes everywhere. One wrong step and the king would start asking questions no one survived. Alaric let his head rest against the wall. Robert Baratheon still lived. Not well. Not wisely. But he breathed. That made everything stall. Alaric lay still, his eyes tracing the flickering shadows on the ceiling. The quiet of the north was a lie. Beneath the snow the roots were already screaming. A king dying too slowly is worse than a king already dead, he murmured, his voice a ghost in the dim room. So what do I do while the sun refuses to set? The answer didn't come from the stone walls, but a memory surfaced, fresh news though the blood scout. Tyrion Lannister arrested by Catelyn Stark. The gears in Alaric's mind turned. If the imp had been taken. But it raised a more pressing question. Did the Lannisters still send an assassin for Bran in this timeline? Well, he whispered. His mouth curved, though it wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who had seen the trap and decided to let it snap just so he could watch the metal break. That news wouldn't stay quiet. In King's Landing nothing ever did, and in Winterfell it would be the spark that lit the fuse. With Catelyn away and the halfmen in chains. Chapter 44 North. The damp smell of stone and the steady clink-clink-clink of hammers fixing armor drifted through the window. Alaric stood in his room, watching a blood-red sun rise over the water. A heavy, slow knock thudded against the wood. Alaric opened the door. Ned Stark stood there, his face pale and his eyes rimmed with red. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Alaric," Ned said, his voice low and weary. He stepped into the room, making the small space feel even tighter. He held out a thick scroll sealed with the gray wax of a direwolf. "I need you to leave for the north. Today." Alaric leaned back against the wall, his face a mask of boredom. "Something wrong, my lord?" "I need this delivered to Robb at Winterfell," Ned said, his grip tightening on the parchment. "It has my orders for our men and my thoughts on what the Lannisters are up to. I can't trust this to a common messenger. It has to be you." Ned's expression shifted, the hard lines of a lord softening for a moment. "Stay at Winterfell for a while. A few weeks, maybe a month. Things are getting complicated here. It's better if you're away from the capital until the air clears." Alaric took the letter, playing the part of the loyal soldier. He gave a short, crisp nod. "Understood. I'll need an hour to get my gear and my horse ready." "Go then," Ned said, clapping a hand firmly on Alaric's shoulder. "And ride hard. The King's Road is no place for a man to travel alone these days." As soon as the door clicked shut, Alaric's bored look vanished. Dangerous? He had enough power to face a small army on his own. The ride did not worry him. What bothered him was that his morning was ruined. Still, the timing worked in his favor. He had matters to settle beyond King's Landing. He could handle them along the way. He moved through the castle like a ghost, keeping to the quiet corners until he reached the Tower of the Hand. With a soft flick of his wrist, the lock on Sansa's door gave way and he slipped inside. The room was warm, filled with the soft orange glow of the morning. Sansa was sitting on her bed, her fingers buried in the thick fur of her wolf lady. The wolf's golden eyes snapped to Alaric the second he entered. Sansa jumped up, her cheeks turning a bright pink. "Alaric? You're here so early, is something happening?" "I'm heading out, little dove," Alaric said, his voice a low rasp as he walked toward her. "Your father is sending me back to Winterfell to deliver a message to Robb. It seems I'm leaving King's Landing behind for a while." The light in Sansa's eyes went out. Her fingers dug deep into Lady's thick fur, and her lips shook just for a second before she pulled herself together. She put on her best lady of the house face, but it couldn't hide the sadness. "Back to the north?" she whispered, her voice tiny. "For how long?" 3, maybe 4 weeks, he said. He reached out and ran his thumb along her jaw. The touch reminded her of the night before, and her breath caught in her throat. "Don't look at me like that. I'm leaving Nyx here with you. He'll stay hidden in your shadow. If anyone even looks at you the wrong way, they won't survive the night." He leaned down and pressed a hard, slow kiss to her forehead. It wasn't the fiery kiss from last night, it was a cold mark, a way of saying she belonged to him. "While I'm away, stay in this room as much as you can," he told her, his voice turning into a low, deep rumble. "If Margaery Tyrell comes by, ignore her. If the prince or the queen asks for you, tell them you're too sick to move." Sansa looked up at him with wide, adoring eyes, even as the sadness lingered. She leaned into his hand and placed her own palm over his heart. "I'll do exactly what you say," she breathed. "I'll be sick. I'll stay in the dark. Just come back soon, Alaric. This tower feels so much colder when you aren't here." Alaric gave her one last, sharp look. Then he stepped back and vanished into the shadows. He had a letter to deliver, and a long road ahead. Cersei Lannister heard the news before the city gates had even fully closed. In her room she poured a cup of wine, her eyes cold and bright with victory. To her, this wasn't a smart move by the Starks, it was a retreat. She thought she had finally chased the northern dog away from the king's protection. Within the hour, she sent out her own riders. These weren't knights in white capes, but killers who worked for the Lannisters. Their orders were simple: make sure Alaric never made it home. 2 miles north of the city, Alaric sat tall in his saddle. His sharp senses mapped out every inch of the road. He wasn't nearly as helpless as Cersei thought. Even though he had left his most powerful support, Nyx, to guard Sansa, he wasn't alone. A blood scout moved through the bushes beside him, completely invisible to the world. Alaric pulled his horse to a stop under the dark trees and called up his system. A blue screen glowed in the air, showing he had 5,932 MP. He knew Cersei would send killers and he was ready for them. He spent 1,600 MP to summon 2 massive, ancient direwolves. The ground at his feet seemed to leak black ink as 2 huge dark shapes appeared out of thin air. With a silent thought, Alaric ordered them to hide. The wolves turned into smoke and flowed directly into his own shadow. As they merged with him, Alaric felt his mind sharpen. He felt faster, stronger, and more lethal. He tightened his sword belt, his knuckles white against the leather. Further down the road, the forest felt thick and heavy. Alaric sat on a rotting log in the middle of a narrow path. He looked bored, idly tossing a small stone into the air and catching it over and over. The Lannister riders burst into the clearing. Their red coats were dusty and their eyes were full of greed. They circled him, their horses huffing as they trapped him in a ring of steel. "There he is," the leader sneered. He had a jagged scar on his face and a cruel smile. "Ned Stark's little pet. Did you get tired of running, boy? Or did you just pick a nice place to die?" The men laughed, the sound loud and ugly in the quiet woods. "Look at him," another joked, drawing his sword. "No shield, no armor. Just sitting there like a peasant. The queen wants your head, dog, but I think we'll take a few of your fingers first."
Whoa, whoa, whoa! Hold up. Stop for a sec. Look, if you've already made it this far into the video and you're still here, come on, subscribe, bro. Help a brother out, man. It's one tiny click for you, but it's a massive, and I mean massive, heck yeah for me. Plus, it keeps the algorithm from thinking I'm boring, and we both know that's a total lie. All right. I'm done. I'll get out of the way now so you can get back to the good stuff. Stick around and finish listening. It's worth it. Peace.
Chapter 45, Slaughter. Alaric did not look up. He did not flinch. The stone hit his palm one last time. He closed his fist around it. "You talk too much," he said. The words came out low and rough. Not meant to impress. The rider in front frowned. "What was that?" he snapped, leaning forward in the saddle. "Say it again." Alaric lifted his head. His eyes held no warmth at all. "I said," he told them, "Cersei should have sent men, not meat bags." For a breath, no one spoke. Then the leader sneered. "Kill him." The riders kicked their horses forward. They barely moved before the light behind Alaric dimmed. The shadows at the treeline thickened, spreading across the ground like spilled ink. 2 shapes stepped out. They were wolves in shape alone. Livy and Rivy were huge, larger than any beast the riders had seen. Their backs rose higher than the horses' heads. Their black fur swallowed the morning light, and their breath rolled out heavy and hot, carrying the stink of iron. The horses lost their nerve at once. One collapsed screaming. Another reared and threw its rider hard into the mud. The rest fought their reins, eyes rolling white as instinct took over. The men followed seconds later. Rivy crossed the clearing in a blur. Her jaws closed around a falling rider. Armor folded with a sharp crack. What hit the ground was no longer a man. Livy hit like a landslide. Her weight crushed one rider flat. She tore another from his feet and snapped his neck before he could cry out. Steel rang uselessly. Blades shattered or slid free without finding flesh. Panic replaced training. Men ran. Men fell. It ended quickly. When the noise stopped, only one still lived. The leader lay tangled in thorns, breathing in short, broken gasps. Blood soaked the ground beneath him. His eyes darted wildly, unable to settle on anything but the black shapes standing over him. Alaric stood and walked closer. "A message," he said. The blood scout emerged from the trees. "Use their horses. Heads on the pommels. Soak the sigils." The scout moved at once. Alaric looked down at the survivor. "Tie him to the front horse. He rides back alive." The man tried to scream. Nothing came out but air. The horses were turned south and sent on their way. When the sound of hooves faded, the wolves returned to Alaric's side. Their massive forms sank back into his shadow, leaving the clearing empty again. "Good work," he said quietly. As he took one final glance at the slaughter, he felt nothing. After living in his world for so many years, it wasn't exactly hard for him to kill men like these, men who raped and murdered for a bag of silver. Alaric climbed back onto his horse. The animal was still shaking, terrified by the smell of death hanging in the air. He turned his horse north and rode away, leaving the bloody mess behind. 1 week later. The air had changed. The warm, salty breeze of the south was gone, replaced by a biting, damp chill. Alaric stood on a high, windy ridge, his heavy cloak snapping in the gusts. Below him, the Green Fork River roared, a violent, muddy rush of water that cut the land in two. Sitting right on top of that water was the twins. The home of House Frey looked like a gray, rotting parasite. It was 2 identical towers joined by a massive stone bridge. For 600 years, the Freys had used this bridge to get rich and act like they owned the world. Alaric crossed his arms, his dark eyes scanning the walls. If you wanted to cross the river for hundreds of miles, you had to go through them. In King's Landing. The morning sun hit the castle, but it didn't feel warm to the guards at the city gate. They heard a slow, steady thud-thud-thud of hooves coming from the road. Then came the smell, the thick, gagging stink of old blood and rot. 12 horses walked out of the trees. They moved like ghosts, their fur matted with dried gore. The guards ran out to meet them but jumped back in horror. Hanging from every saddle were the severed heads of the men Cersei had sent to kill Alaric. Their faces were twisted in pure terror. Their Lannister badges had been ripped off and soaked in filth, tied to the horses' necks like sick party streamers. The leader was tied to the front horse. Or what was left of him was. He was a pale, empty shell, both his arms gone. He had bled out days ago. Back to the Alaric. He felt a small hum in the back of his mind. The system was telling him his message had been delivered. Panic spreading, House Lannister. Reward, plus 500 MP. Current MP, 4,832. The wind howled over the river, smelling like rain and old mud. Alaric stood perfectly still on the ridge, a dark shadow against the purple evening sky. His enhanced eyes spotted movement below. The massive iron gate of the southern tower groaned open. It sounded like teeth grinding together. A heavy, fancy carriage rolled out, painted in deep blue and silver. 20 Frey soldiers rode around it, looking nervous and hurried, as if they were desperate to reach their destination before dark. Alaric narrowed his eyes. This wasn't a normal patrol. The carriage was built strong to protect someone important, and in a family as the Freys, someone Walder Frey actually cared about was a rare find. Chapter 46, Roslin Frey and Playing Fool. System, Alaric thought, his voice barely a whisper in the cold air. Who's in there? A blue screen flickered in his vision, scanning the carriage for life signs and family history. Target identified, Roslin Frey. Context, Lord Walder is moving her to a safer location under the cover of dark. Alaric watched the tiny figures moving below. He had agreed to Ned's request to come north for this very reason. In the original timeline, Roslin was the bait. The Starks had been so desperate to cross this river that they promised Robb would marry a Frey girl just to use the bridge. When Robb broke that promise, the Freys turned into butchers. The Red Wedding had started with a girl just like this one. The sun sank into the river, turning the water a deep, bruised purple. Below, the carriage rolled on, unaware of what was watching from the ridge. 20 guards in gray coats rode beside it, their spears bouncing against their saddles. They were laughing, the sound of men who thought their family name made them untouchable. On the ridge, Alaric didn't move. He just waited for them to get closer. Then the shadows at the edge of the trees came alive. A dark hiss cut through the air. The lead rider's joke ended in a wet, choking sound as his head slid right off his shoulders. His body stayed in the saddle for 3 more steps, blood spraying everywhere, before the horse realized its rider was gone. Ambush! A sergeant screamed, reaching for the horn at his belt. He never touched it. A mass of black fur as tall as a mammoth slammed into his side. It was Rivy. Her jaws snapped shut over the man's chest, crushing his metal armor like it was a dry cracker. She shook him once, a violent blur that sprayed red mist all over the fancy blue carriage. On the other side of the path, Livy was a whirlwind of teeth and claws. She swiped the legs out from under a horse, then crushed the rider's skull before he even hit the ground. Inside the carriage, the world tilted. Roslin Frey was thrown against the wall as the horses panicked and the wood began to snap. The screams outside were short and terrifying. It sounded like a slaughterhouse. Roslin pressed her back against the seat, her breath coming in fast, shallow gasps. Her fingers scrambled across the floor until they found the cold handle of a small dagger. She couldn't even scream, her throat was too dry. The heavy door didn't just open, it was ripped back like it was made of paper. Roslin lunged. It wasn't a real attack, just the panicked move of a trapped animal. She swung the silver blade at the shadow in the doorway, aiming for a gap in his armor. A gloved hand snapped shut around her wrist. It felt like hitting a stone wall. A shock ran all the way up to her shoulder and her fingers flew open. The dagger clattered to the floor. Alaric didn't even flinch. He yanked her forward until she hit his heavy leather chest. Roslin gasped, looking up into eyes as cold as a frozen lake. Then she saw what was standing behind him. The giant wolf stepped into the light of the lamps. Its face was dripping red onto the mud, and its yellow eyes were level with her own, watching her with a terrifying hunger. Roslin's legs gave out. She went limp in Alaric's iron grip, her voice shaking. "Please, my father. Lord Walder, he has gold. Name your price." "Gold?" Alaric's voice was a low, rough growl. He looked over the field of dead bodies, then back at her face. A slow, mean smile pulled at his mouth, the look of a man who had just realized he made a mistake, but didn't really care. "7 hells," he muttered. He let out a short laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. "The gray coats. The twin towers." He let go of her arm so suddenly she almost fell. He stepped back into the mud as if she were no more important than the dirt on his boots. "I was told a Lannister supply train was moving along the river. I've been hunting men in red since I left the city." He looked her up and down with dark amusement. "It looks like I've made a mess of your guards, little Frey." Alaric shook his head and let out a dry huff. He looked at the carnage, the torn horses, the twisted metal and the river of blood soaking into the ground, and then back at the girl. Roslin couldn't speak. She stayed slumped against the broken carriage, her eyes glued to the giant wolves. Every time one of the beasts breathed, she shook. To her, Alaric wasn't a man, he was a demon who controlled monsters. "Waste of time," Alaric muttered to the air. He didn't help her up. He didn't tell her his name. He just turned his back and began to walk toward the trees, his boots splashing in the bloody mud. He gave a sharp two-fingered whistle to call the wolves. The 2 massive black shapes stood up from the bodies they were sniffing. They gave Roslin one last look, their yellow eyes glowing in the lamplight, before they melted into the darkness behind Alaric. For a split second, the invisible blood scout flickered into view like a ghost following its master, then vanished into the leaves. Roslin watched them go, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Wait," she whispered, but the word was too quiet to hear. The silence of the woods felt heavy. The sun was gone, leaving only a tiny bit of gray light on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched out like long fingers reaching for her. She looked at the bodies of her father's men she had known her whole life, now just piles of meat in the dirt. A new panic, sharper and colder than the fear of the wolves, hit her. She had never been outside the walls of the twins without a dozen guards. She didn't know the roads. She didn't know which way the river went. She was a high-born girl in a silk dress, dropped into a world of mud and teeth. "Please," she cried out. She scrambled out of the carriage, tripping over her own skirts. "Don't leave me here." Chapter 47. It's dark. Alaric didn't stop. He kept walking, his steps steady and even. "You can't," she sobbed. She tripped and fell into the mud, her expensive dress turning black with filth. "It's dark. I don't know where I am." She looked into the growing shadows of the forest. Every rustling leaf sounded like a bone snapping. Every owl sounded like a dying man's scream. The wolves were scary, but the empty darkness they left behind was even worse. Alaric didn't say a word. He just gave a short, low whistle. His horse trotted out from the trees, its hooves splashing through puddles of cooling blood. The horse snorted at the metallic smell, but Alaric caught the reins and swung into the saddle in one smooth motion. He sat tall on his horse, a dark shape against the fading light. Roslin lay in the mud, gasping for air. All around her, the clearing was a nightmare. A severed arm lay nearby, fingers still curled. To her left, the sergeant's body was a hollowed-out mess, his chest ripped open by the wolves. The only sounds were the creaking wood of the broken carriage and her own quiet sobbing. The tears came fast now. She finally realized she was completely alone in a world that wanted to kill her. She looked up at Alaric, her eyes blurry. He was fixing his gloves, his back to her, already starting to ride north. "Please," she choked out, her voice a weak whimper. "Have mercy." Alaric pulled on the reins, making his horse circle back slowly. He looked down at her, his face showing no emotion. He didn't look like a hero coming to save her, he looked like a judge. "Mercy is for people who can stand on their own 2 feet, he said, his voice hard and flat. He leaned down a little and held out a gloved hand. It wasn't a kind gesture. Roslin just stared at it, her body shaking so hard she couldn't move. Her crying turned into a high, panicked shaking sound. I can't," she sobbed, looking from his hand to the mangled bodies of her guards. "I'm going to count to 3, Alaric interrupted, his voice turning sharp and deadly. "If you aren't on this horse by the time I hit 3, I'm leaving. The wolves are still hungry, and the smell of all this blood is going to bring every predator for miles. You can cry for them if you want." Roslin's breath caught. She looked into his eyes and knew he wasn't lying. 1. She scrambled to her knees. Her silk skirts were heavy with mud and blood clinging to her legs. 2. With a desperate panicked jump, she reached out and grabbed his hand. Her fingers were slippery with mud, but Alaric's grip was like an iron trap. He pulled her up with terrifying strength, swinging her onto the saddle right in front of him. She was pinned between his chest and the front of the saddle. Roslin slumped against him, her nerves completely shot. She was still crying, her face pressed into the cold leather of his armor as she tried to hide from the sight of the dead men. "Quiet," Alaric ordered. She could feel his low voice vibrating through her own ribs. "If you make enough noise to bring more company, I'm dropping you off to distract them. It's easier for them to find you if you're screaming." He didn't wait for her to answer. He reached around her to grab the reins, basically locking her in place with his arms. With a sharp click of his tongue, he kicked the horse into a trot, leaving the bloody mess behind. As they moved into the trees, the 2 giant wolves stepped out of the dark. They followed the horse's heels like 2 shadows of death. Roslin kept her eyes squeezed shut, but she could still hear the wet thud-thud of their huge paws on the soft dirt, matching the beat of her own heart. The moon climbed high, making the trees look like long, bony fingers on the trail. The steady swaying of the horse finally turned Roslin's terror into a dull, empty ache. Her tears had dried, leaving itchy salt streaks on her face. Her breath slowed down, though she still jumped every time a branch scraped against Alaric's armor. She couldn't stop herself, she kept looking at the dark bushes next to the horse. Every few minutes, a pair of yellow eyes would flash in the moonlight. It was a silent reminder that the monsters were still there, hidden but always close. "You keep looking for them," Alaric said. His voice broke the silence like a dry stick snapping. Roslin jumped, her back going stiff against his chest. She didn't answer. Her throat still felt like it was full of needles. "Do you want to know their names?" he asked. He didn't sound friendly, he just sounded curious, like a scientist looking at a bug. Roslin swallowed hard. Her voice came out as a tiny, broken whisper. They have names?" "Everything has a name," Alaric muttered, his eyes on the path ahead. "The one on the left is Rivy. The one on the right is Livy. They're sisters." Roslin looked again. As if they heard their names, the 2 massive shapes drifted closer to the horse. In the pale light, she could see their powerful muscles and the way their black fur seemed to swallow the darkness. They moved so smoothly it made the heavy warhorse feel like a clumsy ox. "Sisters," Roslin repeated quietly. The idea of such scary monsters being family was almost more frightening than the beasts themselves. "They're loyal," Alaric continued. His voice got deeper as he started to pick apart her thoughts. "That's more than I can say for your family. I wonder, Roslin, if I had left you in the mud, how long would it have taken your father to look for you? A day? 2? Or would he have waited until the crows finished with you so he could use your death as a reason to raise his bridge prices?" Roslin flinched, her fingers gripping the saddle. "He would have come for me. I'm his daughter." "You're a Frey," Alaric shot back. She could hear the mean grin in his voice. In the twins, a daughter is just a coin kept in a purse until it's time to buy a favor. If Rivy and Livy were hungry, they'd protect each other. If your father was hungry, he'd sell your bones for silver and call it family business. He felt her shake again. This time it wasn't just fear. It was the stinging feeling that he was right. "They're watching you, you know," Alaric whispered, leaning closer to her ear. The sisters. They can smell the Frey blood on you. They find it interesting. Roslin squeezed her eyes shut, leaning as far away from the forest edge as his strong arms would let her. They rode in a long, suffocating silence. The only sound was the steady thud-thud of the horses' hooves. She looked at the dark trees, then at the scarred leather of the man holding her. Finally, she forced the words out. Will you drop me off at the twins? The silence that followed was heavy. Alaric didn't answer. He didn't even move. To Roslin, the quiet felt like a death sentence. She immediately started to panic, imagining him tossing her to the wolves the moment he got bored. Chapter 48. No guns? I'm sorry, she blurted out, her voice cracking. I shouldn't have asked. Please don't be angry. I didn't mean to. I can take you back, Alaric said. His voice was steady and strangely calm, cutting right through her panic. I could turn this horse around right now and ride straight to your father's gates. It wouldn't take long at all. Roslin blinked, a tiny spark of hope hitting her chest. You would? Of course, Alaric said. But there's one thing first. She swallowed. What? What is your name? She hesitated only a second, fear pushing the words out of her. Roslin, she said quickly. Roslin Frey. Okay, Alaric murmured. He slowed the horse to a walk, his chest pressing against her back. But the real question, Roslin, is do you actually want to go back? She opened her mouth to say yes, but the word got stuck in her throat. News travels fast, Alaric continued, his voice dropping into that smooth, dangerous crawl. I hear things. Rumors about a deal. People say Lord Walder is tired of waiting. He's looking to trade his prettiest daughter to get what he wants. I heard he's already picked a husband for you, some cousin with no teeth or a minor lord with a rotting castle and a mean temper. Someone who needs your father's money just to keep his roof from falling in. He felt her go still. Every girl at the twins lived in fear of being traded away, and Alaric knew exactly how to make her worry. You go back now and you're just a damaged prize, he said, sounding bored. He'll marry you off within 2 weeks just to make sure he doesn't lose his investment. You'll spend the rest of your life in some damp castle, having babies for a man who smells like bad beer and counts your father's silver while he sleeps. Roslin's head slumped. She knew her father. She knew he didn't look at his daughters as children, but as animals to be sold. I'm going north, Alaric said, loosening his grip on her waist just a bit. To Winterfell. It's a long ride and the air is freezing, but there are no cages there. I'll give you a choice, little Frey. Stay with me for a while. Be my guest or my prisoner if that makes you feel better. When I eventually head back south, if you still want to sit in your father's drafty hall and wait for a husband, I won't stop you. He leaned down, his eyes catching the moonlight. But for once in your life, wouldn't you like to see the world without a Frey guard telling you where to look? Roslin looked at the road ahead, then back toward her home. The north seemed big and scary, but Alaric's words made the twins seem worse, a place of stone walls and forced marriages. Winterfell? She whispered. The edge of the world, Alaric replied with a small ghost of a smile. What do you say, Roslin? The bridge or the road? The road, Roslin whispered, her voice so soft it almost blew away in the wind. I want the road. Alaric didn't say anything kind. He just gripped the reins and pushed the horse forward. An hour later, they pulled off the main path. They pushed through some thick pine trees into a hidden spot under a jagged rock cliff. It was a good place to hide, out of the wind and away from the road. Alaric hopped down, his boots hitting the ground with a thud, and reached up to catch Roslin as she slid off. Her legs felt like jelly. She stumbled into him, her small hands grabbing his leather armor just to stay standing. Stay by the stone, Alaric ordered, pointing to a flat rock in the middle of the clearing. He didn't build a fire. Instead, he stood in the center, watching the dark trees. From the bushes, a blood scout stepped into the dim light. He didn't make a sound. He wore dark gear covered in dirt from the trail. He didn't just stand there, he dropped to one knee and bowed his head low. My lord, the scout said, his voice a dry rasp. The area is safe. I've checked everywhere. No Lannisters, no Frey dogs. The trail is clean. No one is following us. Roslin froze. She sat on the cold stone, her fingers digging into her skirt. She had heard how men spoke to her father, usually with fake smiles and hidden hate. She had heard how guards spoke to lords, stiff and formal. But this was different. This was how a man spoke to someone who owned his soul. "My lord." "Your Excellency." The titles sounded heavy and powerful. It made Alaric's earlier claim about being a simple traveler feel like a total lie. Alaric gave a short nod. "Keep watch. If anything bigger than a rabbit comes within a mile, I want to know." "By your will, great one," the scout replied. He stood up and stepped back into the shadows, vanishing instantly. Roslin stayed silent, her eyes wide as she looked at Alaric. He wasn't just the man who had killed her guards. He was a leader of monsters. The silence between them grew thick, broken only by the steady breathing of the two giant wolves resting at the edge of the camp. Alaric looked at the shivering girl on the stone, her silk dress now a mess of mud. "Do you know how to cook?" he asked, his voice cutting through the cold. "Or did the servants at the Twins never even let you touch a spoon?" Roslin looked up, blinking through her tired eyes. I can bake honey cakes. And I know how to cook quail if there's a kitchen. But here." She looked around at the dark, empty ground. "There is nothing here but dirt and cold." Alaric didn't answer right away. A thought had just flashed through his mind as he looked at this pathetic high-born lady starving in the mud. System, he thought, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his eyes. "Open the shop. Can I get modern weapons? Guns? Rifles?" "Notice, firearms and explosives are not available." Alaric felt a spark of anger. A single rifle could have ended this whole war before it even started. Fine, he thought. What about food? Can I use MP for something that doesn't taste like dirt and salt? Search complete. Food and drink is open. Available, high-energy rations, sweets, modern drinks. Cost, 50 MP per item. "Do it," Alaric ordered. "Give me something." He reached into his cloak. With a faint shimmer that she didn't see in the dark, he pulled out a heavy bar wrapped in silver foil and a clear plastic bottle of water. The water looked much cleaner than the muddy river nearby. He stepped toward Roslin, and the crunch of his boots made her jump. "You're lucky," he said, tossing the silver package into her lap. "I don't want you starving to death before we reach the north." Roslin stared at the object with wide, confused eyes. She picked it up with shaking fingers, feeling the strange, crinkling wrapper. It was smoother than silk and shinier than her father's best silver. The writing on it looked like a language she cannot understand. What is this?" she whispered, looking at him in awe. "Food from further away than you can imagine," Alaric replied. He sat down across from her, leaning his back against a thick tree root. "Open it. Eat." She fumbled with the wrapper until it tore. A smell hit her that nearly took her breath away. It was the scent of deep chocolate and rich sugar, smells that didn't exist in the Seven Kingdoms. She took a small, nervous bite. Her eyes almost rolled back in her head. The sugar hit her tired body like a powerful drug. It was better than any feast her father had ever thrown. It was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. It's like magic," she breathed, holding the wrapper like it was a treasure. Alaric watched her, his face cold and bored. "Magic is just a word people use for things they don't understand. Drink the water. It's cleaner than anything you'll find in these lands." He watched her eat. Slowly, her fear was being replaced by a dazed, sleepy feeling from the sugar. Chapter 49 taken. Roslin looked down at her lap. Her fingers picked at the dried mud on her skirt. The silk was ruined, stained from the road and blood. She did not look at him. Her body still shook, even with the warm drink in her hands. Alaric watched her in silence. His eyes stayed cold. When he saw the dirt on her cheek, he stepped closer. His boots crunched on the frozen ground and she tensed. He wiped her face with his thumb. The touch was quick and held no comfort. The camp grew quiet. Only the river could be heard in the distance. After a while, Alaric stood and walked to Rivy at the edge of the clearing. He said nothing to Roslin. He lay down against Rivy's thick fur and went to sleep. Soon Livy moved close as well, her body settling near him and blocking the cold. Roslin stayed on the cold stone, shaking in the damp night air. Her eyes stayed wide as she watched the beasts nearby. She did not look at the wolf with the glowing amber eyes as it stood and walked toward her. The wolf made a low sound and caught her skirt in its teeth. It lifted her with ease as if she weighed nothing. A small gasp slipped from her, but she could not move. The wolf carried her across the clearing and set her down on the thick fur beside Alaric. The large beast then lay down close, leaving Roslin trapped between its warmth, the other wolf and the man who ruled them. Alaric opened his eyes and looked at the girl curled near him. "Looks like Rivy likes you," he said quietly. Roslin nodded once. Her eyes shut tight as she tried not to think about the beasts around her. She pressed into the heavy fur, the heat easing the chill of the night. Alaric watched her for a moment, her pale face lit by the moon. A faint smile crossed his lips. He felt a hard sense of peace. He had saved one more life from the fate. Morning broke gray and wet. Rain tapped against the windows of the twins, light but steady. Walder Frey sat at his table, chewing dry bread. A knock hit the door. Hard. Fast. "Enter," he said. A patrol captain stepped inside. Mud caked his boots. Water slid from his cloak and pooled on the stone. "My lord," he said. "The South Road Patrol has returned." Walder paused mid-bite. "Returned from where?" "The night route. They found Lady Roslin's carriage." The bread lowered from his hand. "Where?" 2 miles south. Near the bend by the Green Fork." "Too close." Walder set the bread aside. "Go on." "The carriage was wrecked. One wheel torn off. The horses were dead." "And my men?" The captain hesitated. Walder's eyes lifted. "Speak." "Scattered, my lord." "Scattered how?" The man swallowed. "In pieces." The rain filled the silence. "They weren't robbed," the captain said. "Gold was still inside. Weapons too." Walder leaned back. "Bandits take gold," he said. "Yes, my lord." "Soldiers take weapons." "Yes." "There were marks in the mud," the captain added. "Large ones. But the rain washed most of it away." Walder drummed one finger on the arm of his chair. "And my daughter?" The captain looked down. "We don't know." Walder's jaw tightened. "There was blood in the carriage," the man said quickly. "But not enough to say she's dead." Walder stared at the wall. "So she lived," he said. "Possibly. Or she was taken." The captain did not answer. Gray morning light slipped through the wet trees and shone across the fast water of the Green Fork. Roslin stirred. Her body felt stiff and sore as she woke from a deep, empty sleep. For one brief moment, she forgot the night before. Then she felt the warmth. Roslin stirred. She felt the warmth of thick fur. Alaric was already gone from her side. She pushed herself upright and saw him across the clearing, standing near the river. Across the clearing, Alaric stood near the river. Mist curled around him as he tossed small stones into the water, watching them sink without expression. The wolf lifted its head. Its amber eyes fixed on her. Her breath caught. Her hands clenched in her lap. She waited for teeth. For movement. None came. The wolf did not advance. It did not bare its fangs. It only watched her, still and close enough that she could feel its breath on her skin. Her heart pounded, but nothing happened. Slowly, before she could stop herself, Roslin raised one hand. Her fingers shook as they touched the fur between the wolf's eyes. It stayed still. Then it lowered its head into her palm. Footsteps sounded behind her. Roslin froze. She did not pull her hand from the wolf, but her shoulders drew tight as she felt someone close. Alaric stopped just behind her. He said. Roslin swallowed. I didn't mean to." He did not stop her. He only watched. Then he stepped past her and crouched beside the wolf. He placed his hand on the large head without pause, pressing behind the jaw. The animal leaned into him at once. "Rivy," he said. The wolf's ears flicked. "And the other one is Livy," he added, nodding toward the darker shape near the trees. "They're sisters. They don't take well to strangers." He looked back at Roslin. "You seem to be different." Roslin's fingers curled in the thick fur. "I didn't do anything," she said. "I just touched her." "That's often enough to cost someone a hand." Her breath hitched. He stood and wiped river water onto his trousers. His voice stayed calm. "Have you ever left your father's walls?" She paused. "Left?" "Beyond the twins," he said. "Not the yard. Not the docks. The road." She shook her head. "Once. To see my aunt. With guards. The curtains were closed." Alaric gave a small nod, as if that settled something. "So no." She looked at him. "Is that bad?" "It explains things." He turned toward his horse. His steps made no sound on the wet ground. "Come," he said. He mounted in one smooth motion, then reached down. His hand closed around her wrist and pulled her up with firm strength. She landed in front of him, her back pressed to his chest. Cold still shook through her. He reached past her for the reins, his arms steady at her waist. He leaned close, his breath brushing her ear. "You'll need better clothes," he said. "These won't last long in the north." He set the horse into a trot. At the edge of the clearing, two large shapes rose and followed. Livy and Rivy slipped between the trees beside them, silent as moving shadow. Back in King's Landing, within the silent stone walls of the Tower of the Hand, Sansa Stark stood before her polished silver mirror. The room was thick with the scent of lavender and the lingering, sharp clarity of the morning frost. Beside her bed, Lady and the jet-black wolf Nyx sat on their haunches. It's still flat," she whispered, her voice a melodic friction of breath. She rubbed her stomach, feeling the soft, pale skin beneath her fine silk shift. "Hopefully I am not pregnant after that dummy came inside me don't know how many times," she muttered, a feverish pink flush creeping up her neck as she remembered the torrential wave of liquid fire that had filled her to the core. It was her own fault, she knew, for giving him a full leash and demanding every last inch he had to give. A sharp, rhythmic clack-clack-clack echoed in the corridor, followed by a heavy, demanding knock on the door. Chapter 50 A Chew. "Sansa, are you still in bed?" Septa Mordane's voice shouted through the door. "The Queen wants you in the gardens right now to plan the wedding. Open up." Sansa's heart raced. She looked at Nyx, who sat still and silent like a shadow. "I'm busy, Septa," Sansa called back, making her voice sound firm. "I'm resting. My head hurts after everything that happened. Tell the Queen I'm staying in my room. She'll have to wait." "How dare you," the Septa huffed. Sansa could almost hear her pacing in frustration. "This is the capital, not the north. You don't just ignore a queen." "I am a lady of Winterfell," Sansa snapped, feeling a surge of the confidence Alaric had given her. "I'll do what I want in my own room. Go away. Do not disturb me." The hallway went quiet. Finally, the thud of the Septa's cane faded into the distance. Sansa exhaled and turned to the mirror. She touched a dark mark on her neck, then began pulling up her high collar to hide it. The morning air grew sharper and Roslin couldn't stop shivering. Her damp, ruined silk dress did nothing to block the biting river mist. "Achoo!" The small sneeze made her jump. She stared at the floor, her heart racing as if she had committed a crime. Sorry," she whispered. She kept her head down, sure that even her breathing was annoying him. "I didn't mean to make a noise, my lord. I'm sorry." Alaric didn't slow the horse. His eyes stayed on the gray horizon. "It's the cold, Roslin. You can't help it when you're freezing." "Sorry," she blurted out again. She stared at his gloved hands on the reins, hands that broke steel and controlled monsters. She felt tiny next to him. "I'm sorry for the noise." Alaric exhaled and pulled the horse to a walk. He looked down at her. She was huddled away from him, acting like she was wasting his time. "Why do you apologize for things you can't control?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. "I told you to be quiet when you were crying, not for sneezing." Sorry," she gasped. Her face turned bright red as she realized she had done it again. "I'm sorry, I did it again. I am so sorry, my lord." Alaric shook his head. The girl was so broken by her father that a simple sneeze felt like a death sentence. "Stop," he said, his voice softening. "You are with me now, not a fry. You don't need to apologize for being cold." "Yes, my lord," she whispered, clutching her stained dress. "I'm sore. I understand." After 3 days of riding, the green hills of the Riverlands had faded into gray and brown. They were reaching the neck. The ground felt soft and the air smelled of salt and rotting wood. The morning was bitter. Frost crunched under the horse's hooves. Alaric stopped the horse near a group of twisted trees to let it rest. Roslin slid down, her legs shaking. She didn't go to the trees. Instead, she walked to Livy. The huge wolf sat on a dry patch of grass like a dark hill in the mist. Roslin pressed herself against the wolf's side, tucking her numb fingers into her armpits. Livy huffed a warm breath. The wolf's body heat was the only thing keeping Roslin from freezing. Alaric stood a few feet away, checking the horse's shoes. He moved steadily, acting as if the biting wind didn't exist. Roslin watched him over her shoulder. Her face was pale, her nose red, and her eyes looked exhausted. "My lord?" she called out softly. Alaric didn't look up. "Speak. Is it going to get colder than this?" she asked. She looked at her trembling, blue-tinged hands. I can't feel my fingers. I didn't know the air could feel so sharp. Alaric finally looked at her. He saw her huddled against the wolf, her fine dress now nothing but a rag. He walked over, his boots thumping on the frozen ground. Much colder, he said flatly. This is just river damp. Once we hit the northern hills, the wind will cut like a knife. It can freeze the breath in your throat. Roslin's eyes widened. She sank deeper into Livy's fur. Oh. They left the swamps behind. For days they avoided the main roads, moving through gray mist and black mud. Alaric chose hidden paths where they saw no one. They were like ghosts, a man, a girl, and two black wolves moving through the silence. As they crossed the northern border, the world turned iron-brown. The air became thin and cold. One afternoon, the gray sky broke. Small white flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the horse's mane and Roslin's hair. Roslin wasn't shivering as hard now, but only because she was tucked against Alaric's chest. He had wrapped her inside his massive fur-lined cloak. The heavy wool shielded her from the howling wind. They reached a high ridge. The horizon was an endless stretch of beautiful mountains and trees. Roslin leaned heavily against him, hiding her face under his chin to catch his body heat. Only the tip of her red nose poked out from the furs. Alaric let the reins drop, letting the horse follow the wolves. He wrapped his large, gloved hands over hers, pulling her tighter into the warmth of his cloak. He leaned down, his voice a low rumble near her ear. Winterfell isn't far, he said. Just a few more days. Roslin tried to sniffle bravely, but the cold was too much. Her face scrunched up. Achoo! The sneeze was tiny. She let out a miserable groan and buried her face deeper into the dark fur of his coat. I'm fine, she managed, her voice muffled by layers of wolf skin and wool. Chapter 51, First Kiss. Alaric let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. He did not loosen his hold. If anything, his arms tightened, solid and unyielding, keeping her close. Roslin peeked out from the folds of his cloak. Ahead, the two black wolves moved through the snow with ease, their dark forms cutting clean paths through the drifts. The high ridges of the north showed no kindness. As the sun slipped behind the sharp horizon, the wind rose and howled, driving ice against skin and stone alike. Alaric guided the horse into a narrow hollow built into the hillside, its low rock walls blocking the worst of the gale. He dismounted and went to work at once. Within minutes, a small fire burned between the stones. Its light flickered across the snow and caught in the fur of Livy and Rivy as they settled on either side of the warmth. Roslin sat on a flat rock near the flames, still wrapped head to toe in his heavy cloak. She looked small inside it, her face pale, her eyes following Alaric as he moved around the camp. Every so often she glanced at him as if to speak. Each time she stopped when his dark eyes turned her way. At last he straightened and faced her. You've been staring at me for 10 minutes, he said. His voice carried low through the wind. What is it you want to ask? She flinched and pulled the cloak tighter around herself. My lord, she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. I was thinking about that food you gave me. The one in the silver wrap. She paused, her courage nearly failing. The bread we have is so hard and the water tastes of iron, she whispered. If it is possible, could I perhaps have something like that again? It was very good. Alaric watched her, a dark, amused glint in his eyes. To a girl raised on the bland, heavy fare of a medieval castle, the chocolate had been a revelation. He reached inside his jerkin. A moment later, he pulled free a fresh ration bar and a small bottle of water. The firelight hid the faint shimmer that followed the motion. 50 MP. MP equals 4,732. He tossed the silver-wrapped bar into her lap. Eat. It will keep you not starving. He didn't look back as he adjusted his gear. Don't expect this every night. The road to Winterfell is long. Roslin caught it with stiff fingers. The cold had numbed them, but when she tore the wrapper open, the scent made her pause. A tired smile touched her lips. She took a bite and the sweetness settled her breathing. Thank you, my lord, she said softly. She leaned closer to the fire, resting against the great wolf beside her as the warmth spread through her chest. By nightfall, the flames sank to red embers. The wind crept back into the hollow, probing the stone walls. Alaric sat with his back against Rivy's thick flank, still and steady, the cold barely touching him. Roslin watched him from across the dying fire. The space between them felt wide. Beyond it, the forest loomed even larger, dark, endless, and full of sound. At last she rose. Her steps were slow and unsure, her joints stiff from the cold. She crossed the hollow without speaking and lowered herself beside him, close enough to feel his heat. Alaric opened his eyes. He said nothing. His arm came around her waist and drew her in. The motion was firm, certain. Roslin let out a thin breath and pressed her face into his tunic. Warmth seeped into her bones. His hold tightened, solid and unbreakable, as the wind scraped uselessly over the stone above them. In the silence of the north, Alaric closed his eyes, holding the girl like a prize he had pulled from the mud. Beside them, the two black wolves lay. Their steady breathing was the only sound in the dark. The fire had died down to a few glowing red embers. Outside, the wind screamed, but the hollow smelled of pine, smoke, and the warm scent of the wolves. Alaric kept his arm around Roslin's waist. He could feel her heart racing against his ribs. She felt small and soft compared to the hard leather and steel he usually wore. He looked down at her. In the dim light, her skin was pale. Her breath came in short hitches, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him. The heat between them had changed. It wasn't just for survival anymore. Alaric's hand shifted. His fingers traced her hip and moved to the small of her back. She shuddered, but not from the cold. "You're breathing hard, Roslin," he murmured. His voice was a low vibration she felt against her skin. Roslin kept her head tucked under his chin. She was overwhelmed by his scent, cloves, rain, and raw power. It's the air, my lord," she whispered, though she didn't sound like she believed it herself. Alaric let out a short, dry breath. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and a new, heavy longing. She had spent her life behind high walls, kept as a prize to be traded. She didn't understand why her skin felt so sensitive or why her stomach was tightening. He just watched her, his thumb tracing her jawline. Roslin licked her lips, a nervous and quick habit. "You've never been touched like this," Alaric said. "No," she breathed. Her fingers bunched the leather of his tunic into her fists. "Never." Alaric leaned down until their faces were inches apart. He could feel her warm breath on his lips. He wasn't a gentle man and didn't offer sweet words. He simply closed the distance, pressing his mouth to hers. Roslin gasped. The pressure of his mouth was firm and sudden. She froze for a moment, but when his hand tightened around her waist, she pulled herself closer. Her eyes drifted shut. She didn't know where to put her hands, so she just gripped his shoulders, holding on as the world seemed to spin around her. Alaric didn't pull away. He tightened his grip, pulling her body flat against his. He pressed harder, his lips parting hers with steady pressure. Roslin let out a soft moan as his tongue moved past her teeth. The feeling was hot and overwhelming. She had never imagined a kiss could feel like this. Everything else disappeared except the taste of him and the slow, steady rhythm of the way he moved. She felt dizzy. Her heart hammered against her ribs and she finally slid her hands down to his chest. Every time their tongues touched, a jolt of heat shot through her and settled deep in her stomach. She followed his lead, tentatively moving her tongue to match his. Chapter 52 to Chapter 53 is Sunu, so I avoided it and the next part. Chapter 54 Roslin. Alaric's hands dug into her hips, his knuckles white. The pressure in his chest was a coiled spring, tight and heavy. He surged faster now, his breath hitching into sharp, ragged grunts that filled the small space. Roslin's eyes snapped open, her dark pupils swallowing the iris. She stared up at the man who had torn her from her home, the man now claiming her bit by bit. With one final forceful lunge, Alaric buried himself deep. Roslin's body went taut. Her breath caught as a wave of heat crashed over her, and she let out a jagged cry that was lost to the wind howling outside. The rush hit Alaric like a fever, but he wasn't done. As her body pulsed around him, he gripped her thighs and pulled back with a slick, heavy slide. He let out a low, rough sound as he finished, the heat spilling across her stomach and the torn silk of her dress. Roslin lay there shaking, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She thought the moment had passed, but before she could move, Alaric's hands were on her waist again. He flipped her over in one swift motion. He pressed her down onto her hands and knees, forcing her face into the thick, dark furs of the cloak. "My lord. I can't." she breathed, though her hips instinctively tilted back to meet him. She was spent, her muscles buzzing with a dull ache, but the heat of his chest against her back jolted her wide awake. She was a wire pulled tight, waiting for the snap. Alaric didn't answer. He wrapped a hand in her hair, pulling her head back just enough to tighten the skin of her throat. Then, aided by the slickness, he drove back into her, bottoming out in a single heavy motion. Roslin's back snapped into an arch. A scream caught in her throat as he began to drive into her again with a heavy, steady rhythm. This time he was deeper than before, hitting her with a force that made her whole body vibrate. The wet slap of skin on skin echoed off the stone walls, louder than the wind outside. "My lord." "Oh, God!" she cried out, her fingers digging deep into the dark fur. Alaric didn't slow down. He reached around to grip her breasts, his hands rough and demanding as he used her to burn off the rest of his adrenaline. He kept going until her loud cries faded into a soft, broken whimpering. She was completely spent, her body moving only because he made it move. By the time his pace finally shifted, Roslin had slumped forward, her forehead pressed into the furs, totally broken in by a man whose name she barely knew. The sound of his thrusts filled the hollow one last time. He could feel her muscles twitching and clenching around him, even as she hung her head, her hair falling over her face like a curtain. As the final rush hit him, Alaric gripped her hips. He pulled out of her. Roslin let out a weak, shaky moan, not because she wanted him to stop, but because of the sudden, cold emptiness. Alaric didn't move away. He stayed on his knees behind her, his breath coming in jagged, rough growls. He gripped himself and finished, the heat splashing across her lower back and the curve of her spine. It felt like fire against her skin in the cold air. Roslin's strength finally gave out. Her arms buckled and she collapsed flat against the furs, her skin damp and cooling quickly in the drafty air. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches. "No more, please, my lord," she muttered into the dark fabric, her voice nothing more than a ghost of a sound. She didn't have the energy to move a finger, let alone crawl away. Alaric stayed still for a moment, his chest heaving against her back. Then he shifted. He rolled onto his side and reached out, his large hand hooking around her waist to pull her back against him. He didn't say a word, but the heat radiating from his body was the only thing keeping the winter chill at bay. Roslin didn't fight him. As he settled behind her, she simply tipped backward, her head falling onto his shoulder and her body sinking into his chest. The transition from the violent intensity of moments ago to this heavy stillness was jarring. She tried to keep her eyes open to make sense of the man holding her, but the world was already blurring. Her eyelashes fluttered once, twice, and then stayed shut. In the time it took to draw one full, deep breath, she was gone, dropping into a deep, dreamless sleep before the heat of his seed had even finished cooling on her skin. Alaric didn't move. He looked down at the blood and seed staining her thighs, then pulled his heavy cloak over both of them. "System, he though. Clean the area. Clean her and me as well. I don't want to wake up in this mess." The translucent blue interface flared to life in his peripheral vision, deducting the points. Utility Protocol, Restoration. Cost, 1 Monarch Point MP effect, complete molecular restoration of fabrics, removal of biological fluids, and neutralization of atmospheric scents. Utility Protocol, Personal Hygiene, Target, Roslin Frey. Cost, 1 MP effect, removal of biological fluids, semen, sweat, vaginal lubrication, and restoration of skin comfort. Utility Protocol, Personal Hygiene, Host, Alaric Thorne. Cost, 1 MP effect, removal of sweat and fluids. A faint golden shimmer rippled through the stone hollow. In an instant the sharp, musky scent of their union vanished, replaced by the crisp, biting smell of the mountain air and lavender. The dark, glistening stains of her lost innocence on the fur were gone, as were the heavy streaks of his release on her stomach and spine. Roslin's skin was suddenly soft and dry, the cooling fluids evaporated into nothingness. "Search, high-quality bedding," he commanded. Item, Monarch's Traveling Bundle. Cost, 50 MP. Description, a heavy, fur-lined blanket woven with enchanted fibers that generate and trap a steady 22 degrees Celsius 72 degrees Fahrenheit temperature, regardless of external conditions. Buy. With a faint shimmer, a thick slate-gray blanket appeared in his hands. It was heavier than the wool they had used, the inner lining made of a fur so soft it felt like a cloud. He laid Roslin down on the restored furs and wrapped her tightly in the new blanket, tucking the edges around her shoulders until she was a warm, safe cocoon against the stone. As he pulled a portion of the heavy cover over his own chest, Roslin stirred in her deep, exhausted sleep. Her body, though restored to physical comfort by the system, instinctively sought the only source of security she had left. With a soft, sleepy whimper, she shifted her weight, her head sliding from the furs to rest naturally in the crook of Alaric's shoulder. She nuzzled into him, eventually laying her head directly on top of his chest, her small hand curling into the leather of his tunic. The preternatural heat of his body, combined with the magical warmth of the bedding, finally stilled her tremors. Alaric did not push her away. He simply rested his heavy arm over her, his hand settling on her waist in a final, possessive claim as he closed his eyes. As the silence of the hollow deepened, the translucent blue interface flared to life one last time in his mind's eye, glowing with a triumphant gold-rimmed light. Sovereign Bond accomplished. Chapter 55, Sovereign Bond accomplished. Sovereign Bond accomplished. Objective, seal the Sovereign Bond with Roslin Frey. Status complete. Bond established, Level 1 Roslin Frey. Affection/loyalty, 82 out of 100 submission. Effect, genetic siphon initiated, Frey bloodline successfully harvested. Rewards granted. Monarch point gain, plus 3000 MP. Reward, Necklace of Vigor, summoning options plus, Disharmony Gauntlet. Current balance, 7674 MP. 4,782 points before, after spending 108 points on rations, lubricant, cleaning, and bedding, and then adding 3,000 points at the end, final total is 7,674 MP. The first light of dawn wasn't gold or bright. It was a heavy, bruised violet that faded into a flat, cold gray. The wind had died down to a low whistle, cutting through the cracks in the stone. Alaric's eyes snapped open. He hadn't woken up naturally, it was a sound that did it. The sound of someone crying. He sat up slowly and looked over. There was Roslin. She was huddled against the stone, wrapped in his massive cloak. It was far too big for her, making her look even smaller. Her face was buried in her knees, her shoulders shaking. Alaric watched her for a moment. In the corner of his vision, the gold-rimmed system notification for his successful bond still flickered like a dying ember. The system was good at numbers, but it didn't account for the sound of a girl's spirit breaking. The sobbing was muffled by the thick wool. To Alaric, she looked like a discarded doll. Even the clean scent of lavender from the system felt wrong out here. Alaric stood up, his joints popping in the freezing air. Sensing him move, the two black wolves emerged from the trees. Rivy walked over first, her head low. She sniffed the air near Roslin and let out a soft, huffing breath. Roslin's head snapped up. Her eyes were bloodshot and swollen, her pale face streaked with tears. When she saw Alaric, terror flashed in her eyes for a second before being replaced by a hollow, empty look of defeat. "My lord," she whispered, her voice cracking. She tried to stand, but her legs shook so hard she almost fell back into the dirt. She gripped the cloak tight around her neck, her knuckles white. I didn't mean to wake you. I'm sorry." Alaric walked through the gray light, his boots silent on the frosted ground. He saw her shrink away, trying to disappear into the oversized furs. The perfect lady of the twins was gone. In her place was a girl who felt she had lost the only thing she ever owned, her innocence. He reached her side and sat down on the cold stone. He stayed close enough for her to feel his warmth, but he didn't look at her yet. He just watched the mist rolling over the trees. "Roslin," he said. His voice wasn't a command this time. It was just a low, steady rasp. She flinched at her name, choking back a sob. "I took something from you last night," Alaric said, staring at the horizon. "I didn't ask. I wasn't gentle and I didn't care about your station. I wanted something and I took it." Roslin stayed frozen, her face still buried in her knees. Hearing those words from him, a man who commanded monsters and lived like a shadow of death, felt impossible. She didn't know how to handle a predator showing a heart. Alaric slowly reached out, his palm facing up. "We've crossed a line we can't go back over. To the rest of the world, you aren't a daughter of the twins anymore. But to me." He paused, his dark eyes finally finding hers. "Since we've already shared a bed, I won't have you living as a prize or a servant. Stay with me. Not as a girl I saved, but as my partner. And when the time comes, as my wife." The silence that followed was heavy. Roslin slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were red and wide with a shock so deep it seemed to stop her heart. The tears didn't stop, they came faster, spilling over in a fresh wave. "Did I say something wrong?" Alaric asked, his brow furrowing. He was genuinely confused. The system showed her loyalty at 82%, but it hadn't prepared him for this kind of breakdown. Roslin didn't use words. With a choked, desperate cry, she threw herself at him. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him close with a strength that actually surprised him. She buried her face in his shoulder, her entire body shaking with violent sobs. "I thought," she wailed, the words tumbling out in a frantic, broken mess. "I thought I was just a thing to you. I thought once we got to Winterfell, you'd just leave me at the gates. I thought you'd throw me away because I'm a Frey, because I'm ruined now." She clung to him like he was the only thing keeping her from drowning, her fingers digging into his leather gear. "I've been sitting here for hours, thinking you only took me to use me. I thought I'd be left alone in the snow the second you got bored of me." Alaric's face softened. A rare look of real empathy touched his hard features. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her small, shivering body firmly against his chest. He could feel her tears soaking into his clothes, but for the first time he didn't mind the mess. Alaric didn't offer a flurry of words or hollow promises. Instead, he let his actions ground her. He moved his hand in slow, steady circles against the small of her back, his palm pressing through the heavy wool of the cloak. The simple, repetitive motion seemed to pull her back from the edge of her panic. He leaned down, tilting her face up just enough to press a soft kiss to her forehead. There was no demand in it this time, just a silent seal on the vow he had made. Gradually, the shaking slowed down. Her jagged sobs turned into long, shaky breaths until she finally went limp against him. She didn't pull away. She stayed draped over him, her head on his shoulder and her arms locked around his neck as if letting go would mean falling back into the dark. The silence of the clearing returned, except for the sound of the morning frost melting under the rising sun. Alaric felt her heart rate finally start to level out. "Better?" he asked quietly. Roslin gave a tiny, muffled nod against his neck. Her grip loosened just a bit, but she stayed tucked firmly against his side. "You need your strength," Alaric said, his voice low and steady. "Would you like to eat? The silver-wrapped thing?" Roslin pulled back slightly. Her eyes were still red and puffy, but a flicker of life returned to her face at the mention of the treat. She gave a more definite nod, letting out one last sniffle. Alaric reached into his jerkin, the system's inventory flashing in his mind. This time he didn't just bring out one. With a faint unseen shimmer, he pulled out 3 of the high-calorie chocolate bars. He pressed them into her small hands. Seeing the 3 silver packages, more luxury than she'd seen since leaving the twins, brought a fragile light to her face. For a girl who had spent hours thinking she was just a discarded scrap of silk, this extra bit of kindness felt like a huge gesture. 3, she whispered, her voice still thick from crying. "I told you," Alaric muttered, pulling her securely under his arm so her head rested on his shoulder. "You aren't a fugitive anymore. You're with me." Roslin settled into him. Between the enchanted heat of the blanket and the man beside her, the world finally felt solid again. She started to open the first wrapper, her fingers much steadier now. As the sweetness hit her tongue, she let out a long, contented sigh, leaning all her weight into Alaric while the 2 wolves watched over them in the morning light. Chapter 56, Necklace. Roslin ate the first 2 bars with a quietly, the sugar blooming through her system and chasing away the last of the cold dread that had settled in her bones. As she reached the 3rd bar, she paused. Her fingers traced the crinkled silver foil, and she looked up at Alaric. She nudged him gently with her shoulder, holding the final chocolate bar out toward him. "My lord," she whispered, her voice finally steady. "You should have this one. You did all the work. The writing, the fire, everything." Alaric glanced down at the small hand offering him the ration. A faint amused smile appeared on his face. "I don't need it, Roslin, I am full." "Please," she insisted, her eyes wide and pleading, a soft pink flush returning to her cheeks. "It would make me feel better if you took it." Alaric looked at her for a long moment, seeing the desperate need in her eyes to be useful, to be more than just a burden he was hauling through the snow. He reached out and took the bar, his fingers brushing against hers. "As you wish," he muttered. He unwrapped it and took a bite, the rich flavor a stark contrast to the iron-scented air. Roslin beamed, a small but genuine smile that transformed her weary face. She leaned back against him, her head finding its place on his shoulder once more. "Is it good, my lord?" "It is," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "I didn't think I would ever taste anything like that again," she said softly, watching the wolves pace the perimeter. I thought a lot of things. But I'm glad I'm here. With you. Even if it is cold." She reached out and shyly took his free hand, her small, pale fingers intertwining with his. She squeezed gently as if confirming he was still there, still real. "Thank you, my lord. For not leaving me in the mud." Alaric squeezed her hand back, his grip firm and possessive. He looked toward the north, where the silhouette of the wolfwoods began to thicken. "The sun is up. We have miles to cover before the next frost sets in." Alaric's gaze drifted from the horizon down to the pile of ruined silk nearby. The dress was a tragedy of fashion, shredded, stained with road filth, and caked with the dried evidence of their night in the hollow. Even the system's cleaning protocol couldn't fix the structural damage. The lace was torn to ribbons and the bodice was beyond repair. He looked back at Roslin, who was still dwarfed by his massive fur-lined traveling cloak. She looked adorable, certainly, but she also looked like a refugee. "I cannot ride through the gates of Winterfell with a Frey daughter wrapped in nothing but my spare pelt," Alaric thought, his brow furrowing. He checked his surroundings. They were still deep in the foothills, miles from any reputable seamstress or trade post. He needed a solution that didn't involve raiding a village. "Roslin," he said, standing up and pulling her gently to her feet. She wobbled a little, still feeling sore, and stayed steady by grabbing his arm. "Those clothes are ruined. You can't wear them anymore, and you definitely can't walk into a great house wrapped in a blanket." Roslin looked down at her torn, muddy skirts and felt a wave of shame. I know. But I don't have anything else to wear." Alaric knew there was only one way to get her what she needed. He looked inward, calling up the glowing blue system screen. "System. Search, noble northern clothes. Warm, tough, and fitting for a lady." The screen scrolled through a list before stopping on a perfect set. Item, Winter Rose traveling outfit. Description, heavy layers for the cold north. Includes a leather corset, wool trousers, a silk shirt, and a fur cloak. Cost, 150 MP. "Buy," Alaric commanded. He didn't want the clothes to just appear out of thin air and scare her. He stepped over to his horse's saddlebags, using his back to block her view. With a faint shimmer she couldn't see, the heavy fabrics appeared inside the bag. He reached in and pulled out a bundle of dark gray and deep blue cloth, the silver stitching shining in the light. He turned back and draped them over his arm. "Here," he said, handing them to her. "Put these on. They're made for the north. They'll keep you warmer." Roslin's eyes went wide as she touched the soft wool and smooth leather. Where did these come from, my lord? You didn't have these yesterday." Alaric gave her a small, mysterious smile that made her heart skip a beat. "I got them while you were sleeping," he lied smoothly. "Maybe I found a merchant in the night, or maybe the north just takes care of the people it wants to keep." Roslin took the clothes with shaking hands. She looked at his face, searching for the truth, but she couldn't find it. Still, the warmth of the fabric felt too good to argue with. While she changed behind the shelter of a frost-covered rock, Alaric stood with his back turned, his gaze sweeping the iron-gray horizon. When she finally stepped back into the clearing, the transformation was absolute. The deep blue and charcoal gray of the Winter Rose traveling garb clung to her frame, the reinforced leather corset and thick fur mantle making her look less like a fugitive and more like a high-born daughter of the north. Alaric turned, his eyes taking in the way the dark fur framed her pale face. "You look as you were meant to," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "You look good, Roslin." A soft pink flush crept onto her cheeks. A small, real smile finally reached her eyes as she smoothed out the heavy skirts. "Thank you, my lord," she breathed. "I have one more thing for you," Alaric added. He reached into his gear and, with a faint shimmer she couldn't see, pulled out a light silver chain. On it hung a pendant carved from a dark, ancient stone that seemed to pulse with a soft light. As he stepped closer to put the necklace of vigor around her neck, the system screen flickered in his vision. Item, Necklace of Vigor. Health, immune to all natural diseases and poisons. Protection, if the wearer faces a deadly blow, the necklace will shatter to form a shield, saving their life. Alaric stepped into her space, bringing the scent of leather, pine, and lavender with him. Roslin went still, her breath catching as his large hands reached for her neck. She felt her face go hot with shyness and looked down at the frost on the grass. Chapter 57, Winterfell. As he draped the silver chain around her, his knuckles brushed the back of her neck. The touch sent a jolt through her, making her toes curl inside her new boots. She stood paralyzed, her heart drumming against her ribs as she felt the cool, pulsing weight of the stone settle against her chest. "There," Alaric murmured, his voice so close to her ear that it made her shiver. Roslin didn't move for a long time. Finally she looked up, her face a bright crimson. "Thank you, my lord," she whispered. She touched the necklace with trembling fingers. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "But," she bit her lip, her curiosity getting the better of her. Is it very expensive?" Alaric looked down at her, a ghost of a smirk on his face. He traced her jaw with his thumb once before letting go. "Expensive?" he repeated with a rough, amused huff. Roslin nodded. "My father always talked about the cost of things. He said jewelry was just gold moved from a vault to a neck. I wouldn't want to lose something that cost you a lot of gold." Alaric let out a short, dry sound that was almost a laugh. He leaned down, his gaze locking onto hers. "For the cost? That necklace is worth enough to buy the twins 100 times over." Roslin's mouth fell open. A hundred twins?" she gasped, her head spinning. To her, the twins were the center of the power. "My lord, I can't wear this. If I lost it or if someone saw." "You won't lose it," Alaric interrupted, his voice turning into an iron command. He walked toward the horse, ending the talk. "And no one will take it. It belongs to you now. You are with me." He grabbed her by the waist and lifted her easily onto the horse before jumping up behind her. His chest pressed against her back, acting like a wall of heat against the freezing air. "Hold on," he muttered. With a sharp kick, the horse surged forward. Ahead of them, the two massive wolves bounded into the woods, their black fur disappearing among the trees like ghosts. They were deep in the north now. The air was getting thinner, the trees taller. Current MP, 7,374. The horses' hooves drummed against the frozen ground as they rode deeper into the woods. Roslin sat tucked against Alaric's chest. Her fingers traced the cool stone of the necklace he had given her. It was worth more than her father's entire castle, and the thought made her head spin. For days she had kept her questions hidden. But now she couldn't stay silent. "My lord?" she asked softly. "Speak," Alaric replied. His eyes never stopped moving, watching the trees where the black wolves ran like shadows. "Why are we going to Winterfell?" she asked, looking up at his sharp jaw. "You ride with such purpose. What is there for a man like you with the Starks?" Alaric didn't look down. "I have a message to deliver. Orders from Lord Eddard in the south. His son needs to see them immediately." Roslin went quiet, but her mind was racing. A message? She looked at the giant wolves that obeyed his every thought. She looked at her own clothes, which were finer than anything a queen would wear. She felt the strange, magical heat of the necklace. A man who can pull silver from the air does not ride through the snow just to deliver a letter, she thought. She began to imagine him riding through the gates of Winterfell, not as a messenger, but as a king. She saw him walking into the great hall while his wolves tore through the guards. Was he going there to help the Starks, or to take the north for himself? "You're thinking too much, Roslin," Alaric's voice rumbled against her back. "I can feel your heart racing." Roslin jumped, her face turning red. I was only wondering." The horse slowed to a walk as they passed a frozen lake. The ice looked like a jagged silver mirror. Roslin looked toward the shore and saw something small. A single bright blue flower was blooming near the frozen rocks. It was delicate and beautiful, standing all alone in the bitter cold. Roslin let out a tiny sigh, but she didn't say anything. She didn't want to slow him down. Suddenly, the horse stopped. "My lord?" Roslin asked, her heart jumping. "Is something wrong?" Alaric didn't answer. He followed her gaze to the blue flower. "Do you want it?" he asked. Roslin looked at her hands. "It's beautiful. But we shouldn't stop. If you pick it, the cold will kill it. It will die in my hand before we even set up camp." "It will not die for you," Alaric said. He hopped down from the horse. He walked to the water's edge and knelt. As he reached out, a faint shimmer came from his fingers, though Roslin couldn't see it. He asked System to freeze the flower in time so it would never wither, which surprisingly only costed 10 MP. He picked it and walked back, handing it up to her. The petals felt warm and full of life. "Is it beautiful?" he asked, looking up at her. Roslin took it with shaking fingers. The flower stayed bright and fresh, even in the freezing wind. "It is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, my lord." Alaric climbed back into the saddle. He wrapped his arms around her to grab the reins, pulling her close to his warmth again. He leaned in near her ear. "Not more than you," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they hit Roslin hard. Her face turned bright red. She buried her face in her furs, clutching the flower to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she felt a deep new love for the man who held her. "Thank you," she whispered. Alaric turned his attention back to the snowy horizon. The towering, gray stone walls of Winterfell were finally coming into view, looming like a jagged crown against the pale sky. His wolves had been haunting the treeline and clearing the path, sensed his gaze. With a simple mental command, Alaric initiated their transformation. As they ran, their massive, terrifying frames began to ripple and fold inward. The dark fur seemed to pull tight, and their bones shifted with audible, wet snaps that defied the laws of nature. Within seconds, the two monstrous shadows had shrunk, their bulk vanishing until they were the size of ordinary, albeit exceptionally lean, timber wolves. Roslin, who had been watching them from the safety of Alaric's arms, let out a soft gasp. Her eyes widened, darting from the now modest wolves back up to Alaric's calm face. She shifted, her breath hitching as she parted her lips to let out a barrage of questions. "How?" Before she could finish, Alaric leaned forward. He pressed a gloved finger gently against her lips. "Later," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "We are almost at the entrance. For now they are just loyal hounds. Nothing more." Roslin swallowed hard, nodding slowly against his hand. She looked toward the great gate of Winterfell, where the Stark banners flickered in the wind. Chapter 58, Spoiled Child. Winterfell's tall stone gates stood just ahead. After weeks on the road, they were finally there. The path was jammed with wagons full of grain, merchants huddled in coats, and trappers hauling piles of fur. Alaric nudged his horse toward the entrance. His two wolves trotted beside him. People noticed him coming and stepped out of the way, clearing a path through the crowd. Up on the wall, the guards gripped their spears and watched him closely. A guard named Hullen stepped out to block the way. He was an older man who had seen Alaric grow up. He squinted through the cold air, his breath turning to mist. "Hold it," Hullen called out. He looked Alaric up and down, confused. "Alaric Thorne? We heard you went south with Lord Stark. Aren't you supposed to be in King's Landing?" "I didn't like the capital, Hullen," Alaric said. Hullen looked past Alaric to the woman sitting in front of him on the saddle. Roslin was wrapped tight in a thick fur cloak, her face hidden by a hood. Only her eyes showed, darting nervously between the guards and their armor. "And who's she?" Hullen asked. "Did Lord Stark send you back with a wife, or did you steal a lady from a stable down south?" "I saved her from a man on the road," Alaric said. He didn't look like he wanted to be questioned. "She has nowhere else to go. She's with me now." Roslin nodded quickly. Her fingers tightened around the silver-wrapped flower hidden under her cloak. The guards barely looked at her. To them, she was just girl Alaric had picked up off the road. "Why are you back anyway?" another guard asked, leaning on his spear. "Winterfell is crowded. Lord Robb has enough to deal with without people showing up uninvited." "I'm here on Lord Eddard's orders," Alaric said, his face going stern. "I have a message for Robb Stark. It's urgent and it's for his eyes only." The mood changed the moment he mentioned Lord Eddard. Hullen turned and signaled the men at the gate. "Open the wicket. Let him in." The heavy gates groaned as they moved. Hullen stepped back to let them pass. "Take him to the Great Hall," he told one of his men. "Lord Robb is with the Master-at-Arms." Alaric didn't wait. He nudged his horse forward, and its hooves clattered loudly against the stone floor of the courtyard. Rivy and Livy followed silently behind, their golden eyes watching everything. Roslin shivered, though it wasn't just the cold. The massive gray towers felt like they were leaning over her. "Is this it?" she whispered against Alaric's chest. "This is the heart of the north," Allaric said. A young steward stepped up to take the horse's reins. Allaric hopped down and grabbed Roslin by the waist, lifting her easily to the ground. She wobbled on her feet, looking small against the massive stone walls, and stayed right at his side. "Follow me," the guard said, heading toward the great hall. "Lord Robb doesn't like to be kept waiting." They walked inside. The air in the hall smelled of old wood and roasted meat. Alaric stopped at the heavy oak doors and looked down at Roslin. "Wait here," he said. Roslin looked up at the high ceiling. She nodded and sat on a stone bench by the wall, pulling her new fur cloak tight. Alaric turned and walked into the hall alone. Inside, the room was dim and lit by torches. Robb Stark stood at a table covered in maps. He looked older and more tired than before. Ser Roderick Castle, the master-at-arms, stood next to him. They were talking in low voices. "Lord Robb," the guard called out. "Alaric Thorne is back from the south. He says he has a message from your father." Robb's head snapped up. He stared at Alaric, his eyes sharp. He didn't bother with a greeting. Seeing Alaric back in Winterfell meant something was wrong. "Alaric," Robb said, stepping away from the table. His voice was heavy. "If my father sent you all this way instead of a raven, the news must be bad." Alaric walked forward. He seemed different, harder and more serious than the ward Robb remembered. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a piece of parchment. The Stark wolf seal was still unbroken. He slid the letter across the map table. "Ravens can be shot down," Alaric said. "Lord Stark wanted this in your hands. He couldn't risk the Lannisters seeing it." Robb snapped the wax seal and flattened the paper. His mouth set into a hard, thin line as he read his father's rushed handwriting. Ser Roderick leaned in close, his white whiskers twitching as he followed the lines. "He wants the guards doubled at the river," Robb whispered, looking up at Alaric. "He's telling the smiths to start making armor. He writes like war is already here." Alaric looked at him deadpan. "No kidding, Robb." In his head, Alaric couldn't believe the Starks were still acting surprised. It was simple. His mother had kidnapped or arrested the Queen's brother. You don't do that and expect a peaceful Sunday. Arresting Tyrion Lannister was like pouring oil on a woodpile and waiting for a match to drop. Of course the war was already here. "In the capital it is," Alaric said. Robb folded the letter. He looked at Alaric's new sword and the way he carried himself. "You did well getting this here so fast. Go find the steward. He'll get you settled in the guest wing." Alaric nodded and walked out of the hall. He found Roslin exactly where he had left her. She was sitting on the bench, one hand resting on the head of a Ryvie. "Is it finished?" she asked softly. "For now," Alaric said. He helped her up from the bench. "Let's find a bed." Roslin reached out and gripped his arm. She kept her head down, her chin tucked into her fur collar as they walked through the cold stone hallways. A steward led them through the winding corridors. The air got warmer as they moved deeper into the guest wing. Roslin held onto Alaric's arm tightly, glancing nervously at the old tapestries and the stone wolves carved into the walls. The giant fortress seemed to weigh on her, but she stayed close to Alaric. They reached their room and the steward left. Alaric shut the heavy oak door, cutting off the draft from the hallway. The room smelled of pine and cedar, heated by a crackling fire in the hearth. Roslin finally pushed back her hood. Her face was red from the heat of the fire. She stood in the middle of the rug and stared at the massive bed piled high with wool and thick furs. She looked at the bed, then back at Alaric, looking completely exhausted. Roslin walked to the bed with shaky steps. She reached into her cloak and pulled out the blue flower Alaric had preserved for her. She placed it carefully on the bedside table. The petals looked bright and alive against the gray stone. She sank into the thick furs, her body finally giving in to how tired she was. But as soon as she felt the warmth of the bed, she bolted upright. Her face turned bright red with embarrassment. She stood up quickly and tried to smooth out her traveling clothes with shaking hands. She walked over to Alaric, keeping her head down. "Forgive me, my lord," she whispered. "I didn't even help you get settled. I went straight to the bed like a spoiled child. I should be serving you, not resting while you're still standing." Chapter 59, New Summons. Alaric watched her, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't let her finish. He reached out and cupped her face in his large gloved hands, forcing her to look up at him. "There is no need for that," he said quietly. Before she could say another word, he hooked his arms under her knees and back, lifting her off the floor. He carried her back to the bed and tucked her into the thick furs. He pulled the heavy blanket up to her chin, wrapping her up like a warm cocoon. He leaned against the side of the bed, looking down at her. "Sleep, Rose," he told her, the nickname coming naturally and soft. "You've been riding for days through rain and ice. You're exhausted, even if you're too proud to say it." Roslin looked up at him, her heart settling at the new name. Her breathing finally slowed down as the warmth of the fire and the safety of the room took hold. Her fingers curled into the edge of the blanket, and her eyes began to flutter shut. Alaric pulled a chair over to the frosted window. The dull gray light of the north cast long shadows across the floor. He sat in the silence, watching Roslin sleep for a moment before turning his focus to the air in front of him. With a thought, he called up the glowing blue system screen. A gold notification popped up, Sovereign Bond, Level 1. It confirmed he had successfully claimed the Frey bloodline. He checked his balance. He had 7,374 MP to spend. He started looking through new rewards. Because of his bond with Roslin, new summoning options had appeared. The interface hummed, flickering with a dark gold light as the list updated. The system screen glowed with a new list of summons. Unit, Blood Knight. Cost, 300 MP. These were 7-foot-tall giants in black and red armor. They didn't care about honor or rules, they were cold killers who did exactly what they were told. Alaric knew they'd be perfect for dealing with the honorable men of the north who wouldn't expect a knife in the dark. At 300 MP, he could easily afford a small army of them. But as he scrolled down, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His eyes widened at the next option. Unit, Demon. Cost, 3,000 MP. He rubbed his eyes, making sure he was seeing it right. He hadn't expected a bond with Roslin to unlock something like this. He clicked for more details. Description: Masters of lies and mind games. They can look exactly like humans to sneak into cities and castles. They prefer using fear and manipulation over fighting. Note: demons are selfish. Even when they obey you, they are always looking for a way to help themselves. Alaric went silent. He had expected a demon to be a powerhouse of magic and muscle, not a silver-tongued liar. Still, a master of deception could take down an entire kingdom without ever swinging a sword. The price was steep, 3,000 MP, and the warning about them being self-serving was a red flag. He looked over at the bed where Rose was sleeping peacefully. Self-serving, Alaric whispered to the empty room. He didn't need loyalty, he just needed a tool. He had over 7,000 MP. The idea of destroying his enemies from the inside out was too tempting to pass up. It was a risk, but one he was willing to take. Alaric stared at the warning on the screen. He wasn't afraid of a monster, but he didn't like the idea of a tool that worked against him. System, he whispered, his eyes narrowing. Can the demon actually betray me? Can it go against my direct orders? The blue light of the interface flickered and new text appeared. System response, negative. Clarification, you are the absolute master. No summon can disobey a direct command or act harmfully toward you. Their self-serving nature applies to how they execute tasks and interact with others. To them, you are the supreme authority. A second line of text scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Note, as your bonded partner, Roslin also holds authority. Summons will follow her commands as long as they do not contradict your own. Alaric leaned back in his chair, his tension easing. If the system guaranteed their obedience, then their selfishness didn't matter. They were just high-maintenance tools. The fact that they would listen to Rose was an added bonus. It meant she would have a guardian even when he wasn't by her side. He tapped the screen, the interface rippling like water beneath his finger. Purchase selected, unit, demon. Cost, 3,000 MP. Remaining balance, 4,374 MP. The room went colder. The fire in the hearth died down, the flames shrinking until the logs were dark. The crackling stopped. The room became so quiet it made Alaric's ears ring. Black liquid like ink seeped up through the rug. A sharp smell filled the air, burnt sulfur and rotting paper. Thick smoke twisted and folded over itself. It grew into the shape of shoulders, arms, and a spine. There was no sound or breath, just the smoke moving. A man stepped out. He was a head taller than Alaric, with a thin, narrow frame. He wore plain, worn-out robes. He didn't look like a monster at all. He opened his eyes. They were clear, focused, and brown. He looked around at the walls and the floor before his gaze locked onto Alaric. The smoke vanished. The man stood there. Then the man dropped to one knee. He bowed his head. "My monarch," he said. His voice was smooth and calm. "I felt your call." He gripped his own leg, waiting. "I am in your service." Chapter 60 A tea. Alaric leaned back, narrowing his eyes as he studied the figure on the floor. "Get up." The demon rose in one fluid motion. He stood tall and still, his eyes locked on Alaric, waiting. "My monarch," he said, bowing low. "A servant is easier to command if he has a name. Right now I am nothing. What should I be called?" Alaric looked at the man's sharp, intelligent face. He didn't want anything grand or dramatic. "Day," Alaric said. The demon bowed again, his forehead nearly touching his knees. "Day," he repeated. "A good name. What is your first command?" "I am ready to work." Alaric glanced at the girl sleeping on the bed before looking back at the demon. "For now, just learn. Move through Winterfell. Map out every hallway, every guard rotation, and every face in this castle. I want you to know this place better than the Starks do." A spark lit up Day's brown eyes, though he kept his head down. "Information. I can do that. I'll move through the shadows and listen to the gossip. No one will see me but you." "Don't cause any trouble," Alaric warned. "As you wish, master," Day whispered. He stepped back into a dark corner. His body blurred, blending into the gloom until the corner was empty. Alaric stood up from the window. The blue screen vanished as he turned away from the dying fire. He walked over to the large bed where Roslin lay still under the thick furs. He lifted the edge of the blanket, which stayed at a steady, comfortable warmth, and slid in beside her. The movement made Roslin stir. She opened her eyes and blinked in the dim light. When she saw it was him, she relaxed. She didn't say anything, but she moved over to make room and leaned against his side with a quiet sigh. She reached out and locked her fingers with his, tucking her head against his shoulder. Alaric used his free hand to gently brush some hair away from her face. He wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. Inside the thick stone walls of Winterfell, they both finally fell into a deep sleep. The stone walls of Winterfell were cold, but the room stayed warm. As the gray morning light came through the window, Alaric woke up. He was a light sleeper, and his new powers made his senses even sharper. Beside him, Roslin started to wake. She breathed in quick, soft gasps as she realized where she was. Roslin blinked, her face heating up as she realized she was still tucked into the crook of Alaric's arm. She started to scramble back, an apology already forming, but Alaric leaned in. He pressed his lips to hers, slow and heavy. Roslin's eyes stayed wide for a second before they drifted shut. Her fingers bunched into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. When he pulled away, she was breathless. "Good morning, Roslin," he said. "Good morning, my lord," she whispered. Her hands shook, but she didn't look away. Alaric reached for the laces of her gown. His movements were steady, unhurried. Roslin's face went dark pink, but she didn't pull back. Instead, her trembling fingers reached for the buttons on his tunic to help. She didn't feel the fear she had heard the maids at the twins whisper about, the stories of bruised skin and cruel husbands. Alaric hadn't raised a hand to her. He had fed her and kept her safe. She watched him, her gaze lingering on his face. She wasn't just doing this because he was her master, she wanted to be there. "My lord," she whispered, leaning her forehead against his chest. "I'm glad it was you who found me." Alaric didn't answer, but his hand settled firmly on the small of her back. Hours later, the room was quiet. The scent of wood smoke and sweat hung in the air. Roslin lay draped across Alaric's chest, her skin warm and her limbs heavy. She took a shaky breath, tracing the white lines of a scar on his shoulder. Her body ached, but her expression was calm. Alaric kept his hand on her back, feeling the steady thrum of her heart. He glanced at the window where the morning sun was starting to cut through the frost. It was time to move. "My lo." Roslin started. She hesitated, her fingers tugging at the edge of the furs. "The maids at the twins, they talked about a medicine. A tea. To stop a child from coming. Is it possible to get some? I don't want to carry a baby before we are wed." Chapter 61. Alaric leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I will get it for you, Rose," he said quietly. Roslin let out a long breath and nodded against his chest. The fear she had felt back at the twins was fading. She felt safe and protected in his arms. They lay in silence for a while, listening to the fire. Alaric rubbed his hand down her arm, then a teasing smirk grew on his face. "You know," he whispered, his voice low and playful. "You weren't exactly quiet this morning." Roslin froze. Her face turned bright red. "My lord," she squeaked, hiding her face against his neck. "Who was it I heard moaning so loudly?" he teased. He tightened his grip on her waist and laughed softly. "These walls are thick, but I think the guards in the courtyard might have heard you." "Please," she whispered into his shoulder. She was embarrassed, but she didn't pull away. She playfully swatted his chest. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She actually liked the man who had taken her away from her father. Alaric watched her blush. She looked more like a lady now and less like a girl on the run. He sat up and the cold air hit his skin. Though because of his buff, the chill didn't bother him at all. "How about you stay here and rest while I go out?" Alaric said. "The castle is busy and it's too cold for you to be out." Roslin nodded, pulling herself from the warmth of the furs. Though her limbs felt heavy and a deep weariness clung to her bones, she stood to help him dress. Her hands lingered as she smoothed the grain of his leather vest, her gaze fixed steadily on his chest, avoiding his eyes. Alaric tightened the buckle of his belt and checked the hang of his sword. It was only then that he noticed her standing on the unforgiving stone floor, her feet bare against the cold. He reached out, his hand ruffling her hair with a playful roughness that pulled a faint flickering smile from her lips. With a low whistle, Livy and Rivy trotted into the room, still wearing the deceptive guise of ordinary hounds. Heading straight for the hearth of the bed. "They'll stay with you," Alaric promised. Roslin nodded silently, watching as the two wolves leaped onto the foot of the bed and curled into tight circles. Though their bodies settled, Alaric stepped into the hallway, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. "Bolt it from the inside," his voice called out, muffling as his footsteps began to recede. Alaric leaned against a stone pillar in the glass gardens, his eyes closed. In his mind, a cold connection stretched hundreds of miles south to King's Landing. He reached out to the blood scout he had left behind, and the report flooded his mind, not in words but in sharp, flickering images. He saw King Robert pacing the Red Keep, restless and annoyed by the constant bickering between the Starks and Lannisters. The king was already planning his escape, a grand hunt in the Kingswood to find a boar. According to the scout, he would be leaving within the next few weeks. The scout's vision shifted to the Lannister twins. Cersei and Jaime were watching the city gates, still waiting for news that Alaric had been killed on the road. They had no idea he was already in Winterfell. Then the image of Sansa Stark appeared. She was staying hidden in her rooms, using exhaustion as an excuse to stay away from Joffrey. The scout showed her sitting on a terrace with Margaery Tyrell. But Sansa looked guarded and careful. Nearby, hidden in the girl's own shadow, the wolf Nyx remained invisible. Alaric let the connection fade. Back in the guest room, the air was still. Roslin was already dressed, her hair neat and her bed made. She smoothed the blanket one last time, a habit she had learned back at the twins. A knock echoed against the wood. Roslin froze. She looked at the door, then at the wolves. Livy and Rivy lifted their heads, their golden eyes tracking the sound, but they didn't growl. The knock came again, firmer this time. Roslin swallowed hard and walked to the door. She opened it just an inch. A man stood in the hallway. He was tall and lean, dressed in fine dark clothes with gold trim. He had a quick, easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Those eyes were moving constantly, scanning the room behind her. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for Alaric Thorne." Roslin gripped the edge of the door, her voice small. He isn't here right now." The man's smile widened and he leaned slightly against the doorframe. "I see. And who might you be?" "I don't remember Alaric having such a pretty companion when he left for the south." Chapter 62, Theon Greyjoy. Roslin didn't know how to answer. Her heart was beating fast, and she felt the man's eyes scanning her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I don't think I need to introduce myself," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If you want to know anything, you should ask my lord when he returns." Theon's eyebrows shot up. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Your lord? You mean Alaric Thorne? The ward who follows the Starks around like a stray dog." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over her. "Listen, little bird. I'm Theon Greyjoy. I'm the heir to the Iron Islands. You don't tell me to go ask a common ward for permission to speak to you. If he wants you to know who I am, he will tell you," she said. She met his eyes directly. "I don't know you, and I'm not looking for company. Please leave." Theon's grin died. A dark flush crawled up his neck and a muscle jumped in his jaw. He stepped forward, slamming his boot into the doorframe just as she tried to pull it shut. "You have a lot of nerve," he hissed, leaning into her space. "Alaric is nothing in this castle. He's a nobody. I could have the guards toss him into the snow right now if I felt like it. Do you really think he can protect you from someone like me?" Roslin didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, her eyes tracing the desperate line of his mouth before she let out a small, tired sigh. "I think you should move your foot before he finds you here," she said quietly. "Is that a threat?" Theon's eyes narrowed. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her cheek. "Maybe I'll just wait inside until he gets back. We can see how brave he is then." A low, heavy vibration started at the foot of the bed. Livy and Rivy were no longer curled up. They stood with their heads low, hair standing up like needles along their spines. Their golden eyes didn't blink as they tracked the pulse in Theon's throat. Theon froze. His hand hung midair. Before he could turn his head toward the wolves, a pale, thin hand clamped onto his collar. With a sudden, violent jerk, Theon was hauled backward. His boot slipped from the doorframe and he stumbled into the hallway, his heels skidding on the stone. He spun around, hand flying to the dagger at his belt. "What the?" A man stood in the shadows. He wore dusty, plain robes, looking like a common servant, but he didn't move like one. His eyes were flat and still. "The young lord seems to have lost his way," the Day said. His voice was calm, but the air around him felt cold. Theon yanked his doublet straight, his face turning a deeper shade of red. "Who are you? A servant? You just laid hands on a Greyjoy. I'll have your head for that." Day didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry. He simply tilted his head, his hazel eyes tracking Theon's every move. "A Greyjoy," Day repeated slowly, as if the name meant nothing. "Ah, the ward of Lord Stark. It seems we share a similar status, though I am merely a humble follower of my Lord Alaric." "A follower?" Theon spat. "You're a lackey for a lackey. Move aside." "I'm afraid I cannot," Day said, stepping smoothly into Theon's path as the Ironborn tried to push back toward the door. "My master is very particular about his privacy. And his guests. A man of your high standing shouldn't be seen loitering at the door of a common ward, should he? What would the Starks think of the great Kraken's heir acting like a stable boy chasing skirts?" Theon's jaw dropped. The insult was wrapped in such polite language that he struggled to find a comeback. I was introducing myself." "You were forcing your foot into a doorway," Day corrected, his smile thin and cold. "In some places, that is how men lose their toes. In others, it is how they lose their reputation. If Lord Robb heard you were harassing a lady under his roof, I wonder which you would lose first." Theon looked from the strange, calm servant to the two wolves now standing at the threshold of the room. The animals weren't barking, they were just staring at him like he was a piece of meat. "Alaric really has picked up some strange company," Theon muttered, trying to regain his dignity. He took a step back, realizing he was outnumbered by a weird servant and two very large dogs. "Tell him I was here. Tell him to teach his dog some manners." "I shall tell him exactly what I saw," Day whispered, his eyes never leaving Theon's. "Every single detail." Theon's face twisted. He took another step back, trying to act like he wasn't afraid of the servant or the wolves. "Fine," Theon snapped, adjusting his cloak. "Let him keep his secrets. Alaric thinks he's a hero now just because he saved Bran. It seems that bit of luck has gone straight to his head." He looked at the door one last time, his eyes narrow. He's still just a ward. He should remember that before he starts acting like he owns the place. Theon turned on his heel and marched away, his boots echoing loudly down the hall. He didn't look back. Day watched him until he turned a corner. The calm, polite smile vanished from the Day face, leaving it cold and empty. He turned toward the door where Roslin was still standing, her face pale. Day bowed his head low, his hands tucked into his sleeves. "He is gone, my lady. He will not be a problem for now." Roslin looked at him, her heart still thumping. She hadn't seen this man before, and he had appeared out of nowhere. "Who are you?" she asked softly. "I didn't see you come with us." "I am Day," he replied. He didn't look up, staying in his humble bow. "I serve Master Alaric. He sent me to watch the halls and ensure your peace was not disturbed. I apologize for being slow to step out of the shadows." Roslin glanced at the wolves, who were now sitting calmly at her feet. They didn't seem to mind Day at all. If the wolves trusted him, she supposed she should too. "Thank you, Day," she said. It is my purpose to serve, my lady, Day whispered. Please close the door and return to the warmth. I will remain nearby. Alaric sat in the glass garden, the humid air and smell of wet earth a strange contrast to the frozen world outside the glass panes. He was lost in thought, planning his next move, when a sudden chime rang in his mind. The blue system screen flickered to life. Notification, reward granted. Objective met, put the Kraken in his place. Reward, plus 450 MP. Current balance, 4,824 MP. Chapter 63, Queen's Seal. Alaric stared at the screen, his brow furrowing. What the hell, he muttered. He hadn't even seen the man since returning to Winterfell. He tried to figure out why the system was rewarding him for a confrontation. Then a soft movement caught his eye. Day walked toward him, his footsteps silent on the damp soil. He didn't sit on the stone bench, instead he lowered himself to the ground at Alaric's feet. He looked like a humble servant taking a rest, but his eyes remained sharp. The iron-born boy has a very loud voice and a very small mind, master, Day said. His voice was smooth and calm. Alaric leaned back as the pieces clicked into place. So that was you. What happened? Day gave a slight respectful bow from the ground. He went to your chambers. He was persistent. He tried to force his way inside and was far too bold with Lady Roslin. I reminded him of his place. Alaric's jaw locked. The light drained from his eyes, leaving them dark and flat like glass. He said nothing. One finger tapped against his other arm, slow and steady. Minutes passed. Then he finally spoke. You did well to step in, Alaric said. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp that barely carried in the garden air. He turned away, staring at the gray clouds. He's lucky. If you hadn't pulled him away, he'd be a corpse by now. He watched a drop of condensation slide down the pane. My wolves don't show mercy to anyone who threatens those they claim as their own. Day smiled. It was thin and sharp, an edge that sat wrong on his plain face. I believe he felt their teeth, master. He left in a hurry. Said your luck with the Stark boy has gone to your head. Alaric snorted. Let him think it's luck. It'll make it easier to crush him when the time comes. He glanced down at the demon. Keep watching. If he or anyone else goes near that door again with ill intent, don't wait for him to talk. Just handle it. As you command, my monarch, Day whispered. High above the sea, Casterly Rock was quiet. Tywin Lannister sat without moving. The letter lay open on his oak desk, held flat beneath his hand. His pale green eyes did not blink. Tyrion has been taken. The words pressed into the page. He read them again. Outside the window, a raven called. Tywin did not look up. A Tully woman, he said at last, with a Stark at her shoulder. His voice was quiet. Sharp. Bold. Another parchment waited beside the letter. The seal was broken, the wax cracked by haste. Tywin skimmed it once, then folded it with care. Dead guards. Steel in the street. Eddard Stark left in the mud. His fingers came together, steepled. They did not tremble. Jaime had always struck first. Tywin turned to the map pinned to the table. The riverlands spread beneath his gaze, neat lines and painted rivers. He traced the road north with one finger, then stopped. Let's see, he murmured. His gaze drifted to the side. There, resting apart from the war maps and the reports of blood in the streets, lay a single letter. It sat heavy on the dark oak, the gold wax of a queen's seal staring back at him. Winterfell. Theon Greyjoy paced the length of the armory. Heat still clung to his face. Across the room, Robb Stark tested the balance of a new war axe, lifting it, lowering it, eyes fixed on the blade. Theon's jaw tightened. He saw the servant's hand again, fingers knotted in his collar. He's changed, Theon said. Robb did not look up. How? Theon stepped closer and lowered his voice. A southern girl. And that servant came out of nowhere. I spoke to him. He threatened me. In your halls. Robb turned the axe, studying its edge. You shouldn't have gone to his door. I'm watching out for you, Theon said at once. He spent weeks in the capital. You know what the Lannisters do. They buy men. Now he comes back with fine clothes, good steel, and a servant. Where does a ward find that kind of coin? Theon pressed on. He saved Bran and it went to his head. He forgets his place. Men who hide their allies and their dealings don't stand straight when swords come out. Robb looked up at last. His face had gone still. "I'll speak with him," he said. "About the servant. And the woman." The guest room. Alaric stopped at the door and knocked once, twice, then again softer. A moment passed. The bar slid back. Roslin moved toward him as soon as he stepped inside. Her face was pale. "Day told me," Alaric said. His voice stayed even, but his hand curled at his side. "Did the Greyjoy touch you?" Chapter 64, Northern Usurper. Roslin's voice was small, catching on the edges of the memory. She told him how the Greyjoy had loomed over her, how he had jammed his boot into the doorframe to keep her from retreating, and how his eyes had roved over her with a hunger that made her skin crawl. But then, day came, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. He grabbed him by the collar and hauled him back just as he was trying to step inside. "Did he touch you?" Alaric asked. His voice was low, vibrating with a cold frequency that made the air in the room feel heavy. Roslin shook her head quickly, though her fingers trembled. "No. But he tried to, he wanted to." Alaric sat on the edge of the bed. He reached out and caught Roslin's hand, pulling her closer until she stood firmly between his knees. The physical contact seemed to ground her, drawing her out of the panic. "You did well," he said, his voice dropping to a soft, steady hum. He ran his thumb over her knuckles, tracing the delicate lines of her hand. "You stood your ground. That's exactly you should deal with leeches like him." Roslin let out a shaky breath, the tension finally leaving her shoulders as she looked down at him. "He was so certain of himself," she murmured. Alaric gave a short, dry laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't mind his mouth. Let him bark all he wants, words are just wind." His eyes turned toward the door, cold and flat like winter ice. But he tried to force his way into this room. His intentions were far from honorable, and that is where the line is drawn. If he thinks his status as a Greyjoy or his friendship with Robb will protect him from me, he is sorely mistaken. Leaning back slightly, Alaric tightened his grip on her hand just enough to be felt. His lucky day stopped him at the door. If he had taken one step inside with that look in his eyes, he'd be wishing for death right now. A small, dark smirk touched his lips as he looked back up at her. "Don't worry about it. I will teach him a lesson he won't forget. Soon enough he'll realize that being a Greyjoy doesn't mean a thing." Roslin nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand, my lord," she whispered. She leaned her weight slightly against his knees, watching his thumb move across her hand. "My lord," she started, her voice hesitant and small. "Is there a kitchen nearby? Or a place where I might find some supplies?" Her lip pulled between her teeth as she looked up through her lashes. "I know the servants bring food to the room, but I would like to make something for you. Something with my own hands. If it pleases you." The words were careful, a request rather than a demand. "It would give me something to do while you are away, my lord. I used to help in the kitchens at the Twins when my father wasn't looking. It's quiet there and I know my way around a hearth." Alaric looked at her, noting how the girl who had once been terrified of making noise was now looking for a way to care for him. "Rose," he said, his voice dropped to a murmur. "The kitchens here are a maze and the staff can be a bit rough. I don't mind the work." She added quickly, "I only wish to be useful to you." Alaric reached out and ruffled her hair with that playful roughness, pulling a small, flickering smile from her lips. "I'll have Day show you the way. Just stay close to him or the wolves. I don't want another heir bumping into you in the halls." "Thank you, my lord," she murmured, her face flushing with a mix of relief and affection. Roslin lingered for a moment, her fingers still tracing the leather of Alaric's vest. She looked toward the door, then back at him, her brow pinching with a sudden thought. "My lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who is? Mr. Day? He said he is your follower, but I never saw him during our journey." Alaric went still. For a second he didn't have an answer. He couldn't exactly explain that he had spent monarch points to summon a demon. He also hadn't expected the demon to go around introducing himself as a servant with such blatant pride. "He is." Alaric started, then stopped, searching for a lie that wouldn't sound like one. "He's a man of many talents, Roslin. He was sent ahead to secure our path, and now he is here to help me with my plans in Winterfell." The explanation was thin, and he could see the faint flicker of a question still lingering in her eyes. He didn't want to explain how a man could appear out of thin air, nor did he want to admit he'd summoned a demon to play the part of a footman. He quickly thought of something else and changed the subject. How about you go to the kitchen after sunset? Alaric asked, his voice low as he watched her. The staff will be thinner then. Or better yet, I'll find a way to get you your own personal kitchen space. You shouldn't have to elbow through the castle staff just to cook a meal. Roslin looked at him, her gaze softening as the mystery of day was pushed aside by his sudden concern for her. Are you not hungry, my lord? Alaric shook his head. Not yet. I have too much on my mind. Roslin nodded softly, the subject of the mysterious servant finally dropping away. I understand, my lord. I will wait until the halls are quiet. A slow breath escaped as Alaric leaned back, sinking into the thick furs. He lay flat with his arms behind his head, staring at the heavy timber beams of the ceiling. Orange light from the hearth danced across the dark wood. The room grew quiet, save for the distant whistle of the wind against the stone. Roslin didn't pull away. She stayed standing between his knees for a moment, looking down at his face with a mix of worry and quiet fascination. Eventually, she moved to the heavy chair by the window. She sat with the grace of a high-born lady, her fingers finding the soft fur of Rivy's head as the wolf settled at her feet. Alaric's eyes drifted shut. A long silence passed before she spoke again. My lord? Do Rivy and Livy like me? She whispered. Alaric glanced at the frozen flower catching the light. He didn't hesitate. They wouldn't let you near them if they didn't. You're part of the pack now. Turning back to the window, she repeated the words in a faint whisper. Part of the pack. The wind rattled the window pane, the only noise in the room until a familiar chime rang in Alaric's mind. A translucent blue screen flickered into existence, hovering in his field of vision. Main mission, the Northern Usurper. Chapter 65, The Matriarch's Submission. Main mission, the Northern Usurper. Objective, take control of Winterfell. Condition, achieve dominance without triggering a major civil war or open military conflict. Reward, 4,000 monarch points MP. There it is, he thought, his eyes scanning the text. Taking the Stark stronghold without a drop of blood was a tall order, but it was exactly the kind of challenge he expected. He didn't look surprised, a slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. He had traveled all the way back to Winterfell precisely because he knew the system would capitalize on the shifting power dynamics of the North. Submissions. The Matriarch's submission optional. Objective, secure a one-night stand with Catelyn Stark. Condition, must be achieved through manipulation, seduction, or creating a situation. Reward, 2,000 MP plus 15% influence with House Tully. The Kraken's humiliation optional. Objective, publicly break Theon Greyjoy's spirit or reputation without drawing steel. Reward, 1,000 MP. Description, the heir to the Iron Islands is a thorn in the side of your dominance. Show the North that his high birth is a hollow shield against a true monarch. The debt optional. Objective, save Bran Stark from the impending another assassination attempt. Reward, 1,500 MP permanent favor from the Catelyn Stark. Alaric's eyes lingered on the first submission, the text pulsing with that deep crimson glow. Secure a one-night stand with Catelyn Stark. Carrot underscore carrot. He felt a momentary jolt of disbelief, his mind instinctively flashing to the image of the stoic, honorable lady of Winterfell. Then his thoughts drifted to the world he was currently inhabiting. This was a land where the queen was bedding her own brother and where honor was often just a pretty shroud for the dead. A one-night stand with my future mother-in-law? He thought, a dark, dry humor bubbling up in his chest. He ran the numbers again. 2,000 monarch points. That was an astronomical payout for a single night's work, not to mention the leverage it would give him over House Tully. He glanced toward the window where Roslin sat, her profile silhouetted against the gray sky. She looked so innocent, so fragile, the polar opposite of the calculating world the system wanted him to master. Well, he mused, his eyes returning to the glowing screen. If the Targaryens can keep it in the family for 300 years, and the Lannisters are doing it in the Red Keep, who am I to be the moral compass of Westeros? He knew Catelyn was a woman driven by duty and the desperate need to protect her children. If he could create a situation, a moment where he was the only shield between her family and total ruin, that necessity the system mentioned might just become a reality. I won't go hunting for her, he told himself. A slow smirk pulled at his lips as he swiped the screen away. But 2,000 points is a lot to pass up. If fate puts her in my path and the opportunity is there, well, a monarch takes what he needs to secure his throne. He stared back up at the ceiling beams. It's just one night after all. Not much in the long run. And besides, Sansa won't ever know. Alaric's gaze drifted back to the ceiling, his mind working through the math. If every piece fell into place, the payout would be staggering. The main mission was worth 4,000, and the submissions added another 4,500. Combined with his current balance, he'd be sitting on nearly 14,000 monarch points. With that much, he thought, taking King's Landing would be easy. He dismissed the screen with a mental flick. The last 2 submissions felt like easy money compared to the mess with Catelyn Stark. Saving Bran was a matter of timing. He just needed to be in the right hallway at the right moment, play the hero, and collect the debt. Humiliating Theon was more of a pleasure than a task. The boy was arrogant and desperate for respect. Breaking him wouldn't even require a sword. Alaric just had to pull the right strings and let Theon's pride do the rest. Simple enough, he mused. He wants to be a king of the sea, but he can't even handle a conversation without tripping over his own ego. Well, let's start tomorrow, he whispered, his eyes finally drifting shut. The start of the usurper. Sleep took him quickly, a heavy rest before the game for the North began in earnest.